All right. Hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. Get my microphone there. And today we have a happy Easter Saturday treat. So I've been doing Easter podcasts. So I posted up Show on the Resurrection on Good Friday. What was that? The debate that we're talking about today. Basically, I did a devil's advocate debate with Juan from Modern Atheism, whereby I put on the role of the resurrection skeptic, and Juan was arguing as the Christian for the resurrection hypothesis. And I wanted to do a follow up show to, number one, prove that Dale the resurrection skeptic is a dang fool and the resurrection's true. And no, I just wanted to give a sort of a review to some of the arguments. And I brought on a couple friends to see what they thought of how both Juan and I did in these opposite roles. So, first of all, to my right, we have Professor Tavo Abri, otherwise known as Professor Al. How are you, Tavo?
Good to be here, Dale. Thanks.
Awesome, awesome. How's your Easter weekend doing? Like, do you celebrate Easter? I know you go to a Christian church and you lean towards Jesus, but you're not a full on Christian. Do you celebrate Easter in any way, or?
Not in any way specifically. I mean, I have a partner, and we're gonna, have like lunch tomorrow, and a lot of what I do on Sundays is volunteerism. I really enjoy that, but yeah, not. I've never been sort of super heavily steeped in the liturgy. Although Christmas is one of my favorite holidays. Easter never seems like it's as big a deal to me. Maybe just because I'm not used to like being in a culture where I get the day off for Easter. So that may be part of it, but yeah, just gonna volunteer and then have lunch with my partner and have a nice and then mostly spend the rest of the day doing homework and looking at manuscripts and stuff like that.
Fair enough, fair enough. And also, we are joined by the atheist host of Skeptics and Seekers, David Johnson. Hey, David, how are you?
Very well, thank you.
Awesome, awesome. And I know you are a godless heathen. So, what plans do you have to desecrate the Easter weekend?
That seems so redundant. Godless and heathen, aren't they the same thing? That said, as far as plans for desecration, no more than usual. Although, weirdly enough, my big Easter event this year will be a desecration with you, Dale, on the 17th. I will be trotting out a fairly newish argument for a lot of people that haven't heard it. Although a few years back, last time was on Unbelievable. It was with Jonathan McClatchy. I attempted to get this argument started. It didn't quite end up that way. Unbelievable is a very difficult format, and so, but I've figured after a few years, it's time to really brush that off and extend it to a more full argument. And so if you're tired of listening to the same debate, Christian atheist debate about Easter, tune in for that show and you'll have a different one.
Awesome. And just since we are kind of talking about that upcoming show on the 17th there, just kind of in general, before we get into reviewing the debate that I did with Juan, what is your very brief and general take on the issue of the resurrection and, apologists who argue for it and stuff?
I'm sorry, was that to me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think the resurrection is a very interesting thing when it comes to religions, world religions. It's very important in some religions and not a thing in other religions. And I just find it interesting that it's important in the Christian religion, and maybe an interesting study for either a Christian or an atheist would be, how did resurrection grow to become the sign of the truth of the religion? Because religions have been around for a long time, long before Christianity, and it's generally not the sign of anything. I mean, some people, throughout religious history and mythology have been raised from the dead or raised people from the dead. It's just a thing that happens. But for Christianity, it became the sign, and that's an interesting thing because Christianity grows from Judaism, and it wasn't even a sign of anything in Judaism. And yet it happened in Judaism, but it wasn't a sign of anything. And so I think that's an interesting study. That's not the study that I have made and will be making, but I just think it's one of the things that makes resurrection interesting in Christianity. Those are some of my thoughts.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. And Tavo, just turning to you again before we get into kind of reviewing the debate I did with Juan. What's sort of your general take on the resurrection within the Christian religion and that sort of thing, and arguments?
Sure, yeah. And I'm fairly agnostic on some issues around the resurrection. Personally, I'm going to be sort of making arguments pro resurrection mostly in this discussion. But I'd be remiss if I didn't say that the discussion with Juan was really fantastic. I really appreciated it. I really like dialectical processes, and I think you and Juan both have a real strong suit in head-on engaging in directly countering arguments that people present against you. I think you and Juan both do very, very great, really wonderful jobs of that, and I think that was really highlighted by your debate, and you're both very on point. I think because of that exposure to the oppositional arguments that you've had throughout your careers. I hope to foster more of that on my channel, which I hope people check out as well. For those who don't know me, I'm a university professor, and I'm an editor of 2 scholarly journals in my own field, and I try to address theological issues using a scholarly perspective. So, all right, so now a little bit more on my own personal perspective on the resurrection to answer your question more directly. So I have, I guess, I would say 4 beliefs about the resurrection. Number 1, I believe that the resurrection proclamation was early. So I believe that there was sort of an apparent resurrection, at least a resurrection proclamation. And I think that was fairly soon after the death of Jesus. Number 2, I do think that the resurrection is the only singular explanation that we have for the birth of Christianity. In other words, the Apologia Minimal Witnesses model, James Fodor's RHBS model, they're all very interesting, but they're really an umbrella for multiple different explanations. So if you're looking for a single explanation, I almost think we should start with the admission that resurrection is the only thing that singularly explains a lot of different aspects around the birth of Christianity. I do think that the evidence for the empty tomb is fairly strong. That's maybe the second thing I would say. Or I think I'm on the third thing now. So the fourth thing that I would just say finally is I think it can be problematic to over-focus on the resurrection. Martin Luther King actually wrote a lot about that early on in his own theological career, which I find a lot of his writings on that to be interesting. I think if, and I've had this conversation with a lot of people, the resurrection wouldn't matter at all if it were from anyone else in history. In other words, if somebody knocked on my door, or let's use myself as an example. Let's say I died and I resurrected and I appeared to 12 people or even 500 people, or it doesn't matter how many people. It would be an interesting historical note and people would talk about it for a few months. But after that, it would leave the popular zeitgeist and no one would ever talk about it again. The only reason that the resurrection of Jesus becomes a theological inflection point is because Jesus had interesting teachings, right? So if the teachings weren't compelling at all, like if you open up the New Testament and you're like, none of this matters to my life at all, I don't think it would matter. So I think contextually, you have to say that the reason why we're talking about the resurrection of Jesus is qualitatively different than why we're talking about other miracles in other theological systems. And that reason is because that became sort of the hallmark Christian evidence for Jesus having divine authority, in addition to just being a very compelling teacher. So that's sort of my 4 set of beliefs around the resurrection.
Awesome. All right, thank you.
And I've got some videos on that too on my channel too, so please check that out. And I guess I'd probably be remiss if I didn't say Phil Baer is going to be on my channel as well in a couple of days, and we're going to talk about his new book on the resurrection and get into more of the evidence specifically. He's got some interesting arguments as well.
So I'm going to break containment. I know that's how these formats go, and this is bad behavior on my part, but I want to say it while I'm thinking about it, and maybe you can answer offline, Tavo. But while I was listening to your argument, because as I stated, am curious as to why resurrection is so important. The answer you gave, though, seems like it opens the door to the Buddha had lasting teachings. no resurrection. Confucius, whoever he was, no resurrection. Gandhi, no resurrection. Martin Luther King, no resurrection. We'll be talking about these people forever. Certainly for another 1,000 or 2,000 years, I think, in human history. And so I, so you can say, yeah, Jesus, he also had some interesting teachings. I think we would be talking about his teachings too, even without a resurrection. So I'm not sure how resurrection adds to that case.
Okay, great. Important point of distinction. Would we be talking about Jesus if there were no resurrection? I honestly think the answer is no. And here's the reason why, because I think the movement would have been more easily quashed if there had been no resurrection. In other words, I don't think Peter would have been emboldened. I don't think James would have been converted from being a skeptic. And I don't think Paul would have come around, right? So if somebody looked up some word teachings of Jesus, they might have someday been rediscovered. But I think it's very likely that those teachings probably just would have been lost to history, right? Because I think most movements don't survive decapitation. When movements do survive decapitation, which does happen, that happens for specific reasons. And there are various scholars who look at decapitation in social and political movements. Now, let's get to the other that's sort of a bifurcated question. So the other side of it that I want to address is, yes, there are other people that we talk about, right? We talk about Einstein and his teachings, Stephen Hawking and his teachings, Heidegger, Sartre, Soren Kierkegaard. So there are other thinkers. There are certainly other good ideas in history. So not every good idea needs to come from the New Testament. I think Gandhi has obviously really, really wonderful ideas. Gandhi was actually highly reverential towards the Sermon on the Mount, and he put it on the same level as the Bhagavad Gita, which was a really radical thing for him to do, particularly during his time period. He actually really, really extolled the virtues of the teachings of Jesus. So I don't think you have to say that, that any set of good teachings is in and of itself prima facie evidence of divinity. I'm just saying that I think the reason why the resurrection is so compelling is because it came from a teacher whose teachings were so resonant. I also think that if it, from a historical analysis standpoint, if it hadn't been for the resurrection, I really don't think that Christianity would have survived. I think Jesus would have been another teacher who died, and the disciples would have scattered, people would have lost faith, and eventually the teachings wouldn't have been remembered. Somebody wouldn't have written them down.
I actually agree with you for whatever it's worth. I agree with that assessment, but from my skeptical point of view, I would say, and that's why they invented a resurrection. Whereas these other guys didn't need a resurrection. Their teachings were, in fact, strong enough to stand on their own, and I don't think there was anything about Christianity on its own that would have stood.
All right. So
I promise, Dale, I will be good. No more cross talk.
I think it's good for the audience to kind of get at least to get a sense as to what your own positions and that. So, but I do want to turn to the devil's advocate debate. Just one question from Juan for you, Tavo, in terms of your own position, and then we'll move on. But he says, but what if the miracles of Jesus had been real, but he didn't resurrect? Wouldn't you still say that the miracles prove he was divine somehow and his spirit ascended?
Yeah, that's a good question. So let's say that Jesus was a miracle worker and then Jesus died. I still think probably Christianity would have been quashed for several reasons. Number one, I think Paul was fairly instrumental, right? And I think you have to argue that if Jesus was a miracle worker who then died, Paul would have never had his conversion experience. James probably was very instrumental in the success of early Christianity. Simon Bar Clopas, right, was the son of Cleopas, who was one of the two people on the road to Emmaus. Many people argue that his son Simon, who was the cousin of Jesus, who was the second bishop of the Jerusalem church after James, so he essentially took over the Judean Christian movement after James, he would not have had his experience on the road to Emmaus had it not been from the resurrected Jesus and that encounter. So I would argue that if Jesus had just been a miracle worker and people had had a visionary experience of Jesus after his death, I think then the case becomes more compelling. But the problem is then you're just substituting one miracle for another. So let's say, in other words, Jesus didn't resurrect, but he did actually achieve a bunch of miracles. And let's say your case is there was no resurrection, but I believe that there was these other miracles, and then people maybe had a vision and there were post-bereavement hallucinations. Well, here's the problem with that. You're now substituting sort of one miracle that has explanatory power with other miracles that have explanatory power, but sort of requires more evidence and more analysis. So why not just go with the thing that's the more singular explanation? It's a good question, though. I hope that sort of explains my perspective on your answer. Great job on the debate, Juan, though. You were fantastic, and I thought it was a really great presentation.
Yeah. If I drop for whatever reason, I'll pop back in. So don't no emergency.
All right. So Tavo, I'll start with you. Let's start looking in and getting into the debate that I had with Juan, because this was not an ordinary resurrection debate. This was a great switcheroo, or a devil's advocate debate, where Juan was, as an atheist, was playing the role of the resurrection-affirming Christian, and I was, as a Christian, was playing the role of the resurrection skeptic. And just before we get into I know you've prepared slides in that and an opening. I just want to get from you and David, starting with you, Tavo. What is your take on devil's advocate debates in general? Do you think they're worthwhile? Because I actually had some Christians behind the scenes objecting to doing this. So what's your take on devil's advocate debates? Do you think they're a good exercise?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of interesting that we sort of witnessed David converting into like a spectral form and then resurrecting while you were asking that question. I thought that was interesting. So there's my witness testimony. No, I don't think there's any reason to like be afraid of making arguments from like a specific paradigm. I thought you did a great job. I thought it was a great debate. I think it's like, Psalms 27:17, right? Iron sharpens iron, often translated as steel sharpens steel in a somewhat more anachronistic lens. But I don't think there's anything to be afraid of if we switch hats and represent the other side. I think your maximalist fact standpoint was you were granting a lot of facts, in other words, initially from your standpoint of the debate. I think that was sort of an interesting strategy. There were some facts that you were granting that I really wanted to be more the focus of the debate, but I understand the rhetorical power in granting facts. I mean, Dr. Fodor does the same thing where he grants sort of a lot of facts and then he wants to present the strongest argument that he can argue against. So I understand the strategy there. There were some of those facts that I was like, ooh, I wish you'd gotten into the weeds of those particular facts. But I thought it was a great debate. I thought you both did a fantastic job, and I thought it was very enriching, even for people who are not who are not as well versed in the content of either your channel. So I think you're bringing more people into discussion, and ultimately that's really the more important thing.
Sounds good. Yeah, and that makes sense. Look, I figured I could deny facts. Like, certainly I granted about 10 historical facts, and that sort of thing. And yeah, I could have denied certain things. I could have played the resurrection skeptic and denied the empty tomb, or denied the appearance of the 500 and stuff like that, because not all these facts are proven with a 100% degree of warrant and stuff like that. So I still could have been truthful, but at the end of the day, I did feel that the best, if I'm trying to put the best resurrection skeptical case, I have to, in order to do that, I have to accept the facts as I see it, even if it's only on a balance of probability. So that's why I decided, look, if I come up with a natural theory that denies the appearance of the 500, or the appearance of the 12, or the empty tomb, that's not really the best skeptical case I could come up with, because it by definition lacks explanatory scope from my perspective. So that was why I did that strategy there. But
one more quick plug too. I hope people will also check out Modern Atheism and his channel, because I've had some appearances there, and I watch every video, and I don't like specifically just watch the content that he presents that's where an apologist is welcomed into the forum and into the discussion. I watch a lot of his critical content, and I feel like if you can't engage with that content, if you have to like sort of turn a blind eye to the argumentation, then you're not really sort of, I think, loving God with all your mind in a way.
All right. So turning to you, David, I want to. So David Johnson was the first skeptic I asked way back in 2018 to do a devil's advocate debate with, and his answer was a resounding no,
Nope.
never. And so, David, I just want to get your take. What why are you so adamant against devil's advocate debates in general? Why do you think they're a bad thing in your books?
Well, okay, let me regress one half step and talk about very briefly about the law. The law in America in particular is not my favorite thing in the world. I don't think it has been very good to people who look like me over the course of history. Now, why is that? Because we have arguably one of the greatest laws in the history of law. Well, we have a problem, though, at the foundation of our law, this adversarial system. And the point of the adversarial system, especially as it has developed, is not actually to discover truth and provide justice. The point of any adversarial system is to win. That's just the point, and they will do. One side will do anything that it can do to get rid of the evidence or a witness from the other side if they think it's going to hurt their case. They're not interested in truth; they're interested in winning, and so the whole legal system seems to me a devil's advocate system. What comes out of that system is not good, and I tend to think that no devil's advocate system is good. You're just playing with argumentation, and the one who carries the day, and we can stamp it as justice or truth or whatever, is just whoever was cleverest that day. And so I, deep in my bones, oppose that sort of thing because it bypasses deeper, more important things like a profound understanding of truth or profound justice. And so when it comes to debates like this, these are life and death discussions for a lot of people. Maybe not so much for me anymore, but whether there's a God or not, or whether Jesus rose from the dead, it's not a game. It's not a game for so many people. Our laws are being made partially on the basis of some of these arguments. It's not a game. It's not a matter of who's the cleverest that day. It has to come down to the truth of the matter, not just understanding the other side's position. I get that. I get the the quote unquote positive parts about this. But at the end of the day, you've got as many people as possible who passionately believe, who can argue the case and give people real information. I think after a debate like yours, by the way, you both did such a good job that if I were just listening to the show without having any background, I'd be so confused. I wouldn't know what the truth about anything was because the people who argued it like a game and they won from the other side of the field. And now I don't know. I have no idea. I don't want to play that game because it's so freaking important. It's like the law. It is life and death. People will commit suicide if they found out that there was no God or they found out that they did. People are mentally unstable. Laws would be changed. The world depends on this. And I fundamentally can't play it that way, even though I think I could play it and win. I don't want to win. I don't want to win that way.
Fair enough. Fair enough. And believe it or not, your best buddy James is agreeing with you. He says, having been through the legal system himself in a variety of cases, I agree with David. So, David, this is James, the one that you were, kind of
Yes.
going back and forth with last time. So he's
Yeah.
just saying he agrees with you, but he does see that these debates are just part of the way we think, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, yeah. All right. All right. So, Fair
Do you mind
enough.
if I just chime in really quick and
Sure.
say that I thought James did a really wonderful job in the discussion with Juan on your channel, Dale. So if you go to your last video that had Juan of Modern Atheism, James had a back and forth with Juan, which I thought was actually one of my favorite parts of that video. So yeah, thanks for chiming in, James. Yeah.
And by the way, James, you're more than welcome on a Skeptics and Seekers anytime. I used to very famously just invite anyone who wanted to come along. Let's argue. I don't even need to know what the topic is. I don't care. let's do it. And you know, Dale knows me quite well. So if you want to get in touch with Dale, figure out how to get in touch with me. It's skepticsandseekers.squarespace. I mean, skepticsandseekers@gmail.com. Just right.
I
We can
will
put it
just warn you,
together.
David. James is a huge remember David S. James is a huge
I do.
Bible codes person, so I know that you don't like that. So just be careful.
No,
But yeah,
I utterly despise it. But we can do it one time.
okay, cool. Yeah.
So
James,
yeah, I'm game for all of that. I'm actually not the hater that you think I am, but I am intense. I'm every bit as intense as you think I am. But I'm a nice guy at heart.
Awesome. Well, and I will say this: James is better at representing the case than David S. He will actually address objections head on and stuff like that. So maybe you guys will have a more fruitful discussion on it. So, but yeah. So David, I want to start with you. And look, you heard the actual cases that Juan made as the Christian and I made as the Resurrection Skeptic. Do you want to just give sort of an opening? Like, what did you think of the arguments we put forward in general? Did you? Yeah.
Well, I think you both did a great job, and it's very hard to determine a winner. The best I can do with something like that is look at various segments within the discussion, and I can say, okay, I think one won that one, but okay, no, I think Dale won that one. There were some points where I thought one actually won me over, where I was thinking, no, that the argument Dale made was better, and then one, I think there were some cases there where he was able to change my mind a little bit. But I think the hardest part for me to follow, and Dale, here I think you did maybe the better job, although it's really hard to say. You actually stuck with things you believed in, or as many things as you could to make your case. And it left me wondering, okay, how much of this is Dale arguing in good faith? How many of these arguments is he presenting that he knows have good defeaters, versus how many really are things that he's not sure about as far as defeaters? And I think I could follow you better because I know you better, and I have no idea about one. How much was one arguing in good faith on things where he knew there were better arguments or defeaters, but he was playing the role? And so it was hard to follow in that sense. But if you just block all of that out, I really do think that you both did good jobs, but I think you did better jobs at different times. And so it was kind of like a boxing match with a number of rounds, and it would just have to be called by judgment at the end.
Fair enough. Okay, yeah, interesting. Because you don't know one. I don't know if you guys have ever been on a show together.
No.
Probably set something up at some point. But
Yeah.
I would vouch for Juan. He's a pretty honest person, so I have no doubt he did his absolute best to give the best case for the resurrection as he saw it and stuff like that. But yeah, so Tavo, now you have prepared some PowerPoint slides, so I want to turn to you. What was your sort of general take, having heard Juan's pro-resurrection and my skeptical case? Do you want me to bring up your slides? And
Sure. Yeah, I can go through the slides really quickly.
all right.
So I'm going to summarize my personal perspective on this. So I thought it was a great debate. I thought both of you won a lot of points. I guess the question that I left with at the end is, we know that there was a resurrection proclamation historically. We know that it was compelling enough to change hearts and minds and to have people undergo transformations, right? We know that it was at least compelling enough to create a movement, right? We know that people sacrificed of themselves, not just within the movement, but also to quash the movement, right? Because we have like Ananias II, who about 15 years after the resurrection of, or the death of Jesus, I should say, Ananias II was so desperate to destroy the movement that he killed not only James, right? Not only James's followers, but he also ended his own career as the high priest, right? So what made the resurrection proclamation happen? And what made that resurrection proclamation so compelling that it was a historical transformation point? I think those questions are still left unanswered when I look at the debate, right? And so you can answer those questions in one of two ways. You can say something else caused these events, and it was about 15 different hypotheses, right? Depending on whose explanation you like. Or the resurrection happened. Now, the problem with the 15 different hypotheses is each one of them seems to me to be very improbable, right? And that's that even if you listen to James Fodor in his strongest moments, he admits that like the RHBS argument, he was actually on Juan's channel, he talks about the RHBS argument. He only has to show that it's a 1 in a million chance, right? For all the hypotheses to work out for him to defeat the resurrection. So that's not a statement of confidence. That's a statement saying, I'm going to, epistemically diffuse my argument into as many subfacets as possible and just throw them as widely as I can. So I still think I like the RHBS argument. I like the minimal witnesses argument. I think they both have strengths and weaknesses, but none of their individual causative facets, none of the facets of those arguments that have explanatory power are themselves that convincing, right? I think if you look at the grief explanation, so anyways, we're still left with those two questions. What made the resurrection proclamation happen? What made it so compelling? All right, so I'm going to go over what I think are some good points. So this is actually from a different debate that came up, but I think it's an important one. Can we talk about the resurrection through a historical lens? Now, I've used my CTF argument, my comparative theological framework argument, which I think takes historical tools and applies them to theological traditions and makes a comparative analysis. And I think it's a good way of doing that. But I think we can sort of bracket miracle claims, and we can bracket etiological or causative considerations, and we can still come away with a sense of what actually happened historically. I think the core facts around the burial of Jesus by Joseph of Arimathea, I think, are compelling. I think there's enough evidence that will continue to come forward that Jesus had a lot of sympathizers within the Jerusalem community, within the Sanhedrin, within the hierarchy of Judaism, that there were people, at least, that even if you don't believe in Joseph of Arimathea, that there were other allies of the early nascent Christian or proto-Christian movement. I think there's pretty good evidence for the empty tomb. I think there's pretty good evidence for the Gospels as historical documents. They're flawed historical documents, as all historical documents are from antiquity. I think that they're too detailed to be legendary. Embarrassing details are preserved, and we have a lot of other motifs. And this is something that came out of your debate, these 84 factual confirmation in the book of Acts. In my CTF argument, I actually look at religious tomes, religious texts, and canonical literature from 17 different traditions. And I show that the New Testament has, out of any singular work, the highest congruence with what we know historically. Now, you can explain away other details, like you could say, well, these are the Christian works, or works that were written in historical context without actual historical events, and then they just sort of added their own theological embellishments or deceptions. The problem is then you're getting close to the category of a hoax, right? Now, hoaxes didn't develop until the 8th century with the donation of Constantinople. So in this period, writing was not that widely absorbed by that many people. So the idea of having, cynicism or hoax or satirical works was in certain ways it didn't have the same appeal to an author. So I think the argument that an author was writing in a hoax tradition is a little harder. All right. So the undesigned coincidences argument was interesting as Juan presented it. I thought that was maybe one of the most persuasive moments of the debate. I think the best retort to undesigned coincidences has been voiced by other atheists, I won't go into too many details around that to not go into too much back and forth. I'll let people absorb what's on the slide here. But I do want to say that undesigned coincidences, I think, are interesting. I think at the very least, everyone, even the skeptical scholars who look at undesigned coincidences, says that there has to be an earlier tradition behind these instances. And again, I think if you look at lies or hallucinations, they're really, really critically weak. I think if you look at legendary development, we know we have certain definitions of what legends consist of, and we know that none of the theological narratives around the resurrection have the features of legends. I shouldn't say none, but very few of them. We know that because of the pre-Pauline nature of the First Corinthians Creed, we know that there was an early resurrection proclamation. I think most historical scholars would agree, and we can kind of quibble about this percentage that Ben Shaw gave, I think, on your channel that was quoted during the debate. We can quibble about the percentages, or we can quibble, was this in the first year, the second year? Most people will still date this to very early. So most people will argue that the resurrection proclamation was an early thing. So I think we can almost take that for granted in this debate. We know that there were hostile witnesses who Saul of Tarsus started out as a persecutor and became Paul, right? We know James was essentially absent from the disciples' experiences. And then even at the moment of Jesus' death, his mother was trusted to the protection of to John rather than James. I think these things indicate that James was not a part of the movement. And then after the death of Jesus, James became part of the movement. We know that James's experience with the resurrected Jesus is tested in at least several different Christian traditions. And then we know, I'm going to skip over some of these slides because I think I'm close to the end here and I don't want to take up too much time. But yeah, that's my last slide. So I guess the things that I just want to recap with, and I hope we'll be able to get down to the core of these, is there any singular explanation that explains the events around the birth of Christianity, why the resurrection proclamation occurred, and why it was uniquely compelling, so much so that it transformed not only the disciples in the proto-Christian community, but also the initial, not the initial, but the early Jewish community, right? Barring that, if we can't answer the questions of why the resurrection proclamation happened and why that resurrection proclamation became compelling, we have to at least provide alternative explanations that are convincing. If we can't do that, if we can't explain the events, and we can't explain the events in a way that seems like it logically makes sense, then I think we've put ourselves in sort of a narrow wedge where we have to accept that something miraculous happened around the birth of Christianity. Now, I will say again, I don't go into this in this presentation, but check out my channel because I go into a lot of other arguments around the divine authority of Jesus that don't necessarily hinge upon the resurrection in quite such a narrow way. And I think there's sort of ancillary evidence that you can look at in addition to the resurrection that I think outside of the resurrection make the resurrection case more compelling. In other words, if there's pretty good evidence around divine authority of Jesus, around the miracles of Jesus, around the transformations that happened in the Second Temple, and around other events of the first century and other sort of early and later antiquity traditions, I think that ancillary evidence makes the resurrection itself more compelling. All right, so I'll probably stop there. I hope that wasn't too wordy, but I'm looking into getting into tackling some of these questions.
Absolutely, yeah. And okay, perfect. So, yeah, I think that was a great take there, Tavo and David, in terms of your general take. And I think the best thing to do now is I want to split it up. I want to look at first starting with his main opening argument, and then we can get into mine because starting with Juan, the pro-resurrection argument he gave, I'll admit I was a little bit surprised with what he thought was the best argument for the resurrection. He went for a Lydia McGrew, Jonathan McLatchie maximal facts approach. And on that front, I would agree on the level of explanatory hypotheses, the maximal facts approach is clearly superior. The trade-off is obviously, but can you establish all of those details are in fact historical facts or not, kind of thing. Whereas a minimal facts approach, I thought Juan as a skeptic might think, well, maybe Gary Habermas's minimal facts would be the best case, but he sort of switched it up and said the maximal facts is the best. So I just want to get from you, David and Tavo, do you guys want to discuss what did you guys think of Juan's case, where his opening was, I'm going to argue for this maximal facts case that the Gospels and all their details on the resurrection appearances, the empty tomb, they can be accepted as eyewitness testimony. And the evidence for that is largely based on things like undesigned coincidences and stuff like that. So, David, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think anyone who's heard me talk about it knows that I'm not a fan of the minimal facts approach. I think the minimal facts are too minimal to matter. They don't get you anywhere. So you still have to do all of the work, even if you grant the minimal facts. The McGrews, they're the maximalists, if I recall Lydia in particular. I think they have a better case with the maximal facts approach. But to me, this is all kind of wrong-headed because it's trying to prove the resurrection historically, which is a thing that I don't think that you can do. Fundamentally, I don't think that you can do it. So if we just look at a different case, say the walls of Jericho, the defeat of Jericho, can you use history to show that God gave his people this victory? You cannot. You can use history to see whether Jericho was a real city, whether it had walls, whether it was defeated. What we know about Jericho is defeated many times. And so it's real hard to pinpoint one claim of defeat with Jericho. They were highly defeatable people, apparently. But their city maintained. But here's the thing, the more interesting thing about the Jericho story is how it was defeated. They blew these trumpets, you see, and they did this march and the walls fell. There is zero chance that you can prove any of that in history. You can study history until you're dead. You will never get that. Can't be done. The resurrection is a little bit like that. What we can study are when people started talking about a resurrection, what people did as a result of believing that a resurrection took place. Of course, I hope that the researcher who does this also researches the resurrection of Romulus. They don't, but that would be good. There are things that history can do for us here, but it's never going to get us to the resurrection. So I don't care how many facts you put on it. You can put the 6 minimal facts. You can do the extended 12 minimal facts. You can go for a maximalist facts approach. But ultimately, the resurrection is a miracle. I'll say more about this later, at least at the end. The resurrection is a miracle built on faith. Ultimately, the way most people are supposed to interact with the resurrection is through faith. If God had wanted the resurrection to be purely evidential, something that could be proven that way, he would have done it better. There would, in fact, be actual proof that required no faith, something very lasting, like, for instance, Jesus sitting on a throne in Jerusalem for the last 2,000 years, or living in a hut in Jerusalem for the last 2,000 years. There are ways that it could be done without doubt for all people for all time. That's not how God wanted to do it. And so the very fact that he wanted there to be a veil of mystery around whether it happened. When Jesus rose, he didn't rose and appear in the sky so that everybody could see him and write about it. A relatively small group of people. So I think the whole approach of let's find the right number of facts to prove a resurrection is wrong-headed. It's a miracle that requires faith. That is your entrance into the kingdom of God. It is through faith, not through what some historical scholar can tell you about some minimal or maximal number of facts and tell you what to think about those facts. So I think it's all wrong-headed. And if I were going to be arguing on the plus side of resurrection, I would not be arguing it as an evidentialist at all. I just think that's the wrong approach, and you end up with the wrong kind of believer when you get the kind of believer who is only there because they saw enough historical evidence. I don't think that's the goal of Christianity at all.
Interesting. Okay, and just Tavo, before I go to you to get your take on Juan's choice, Juan sort of explains himself. He says, I guess the reason he went for this maximal facts approach is because he doesn't share the intuition that some Christians have that Paul and James are super hard to explain away naturalistically. So that's part of the reason why he's saying, well, it's really all about the appearance to the 12 disciples, and for that, you get most of the details in the Gospels and stuff like that. So I think that's what he's saying. But yeah, Tavo, what did you make about Juan's strategy of the best resurrection case does come from this maximal facts approach as opposed to, the minimal facts approach, or the approach I took in the debate as sort of a moderate facts approach? Yeah.
Yeah, I guess my personal perspective is somewhere between minimal and maximal facts. So let me address that first. I think, again, resurrection proclamation being early, I think that's granted. The resurrection case being compelling to people, I think that's also a very, very easy argument to win. Now you have to say why, right? And I think that's the real challenge, and that's where the debate begins. So I'm somewhere, and I think you can represent the resurrection proclamation happening, and that proclamation being compelling to people with a lot of different sets of minimal and maximal facts. I do want to address what Juan said more specifically. I think Paul is very hard to explain, right? The best explanation that I've heard from anyone about why Paul had his conversion experience, first of all, we don't have many conversion experiences in many religions. Ashok is an example, who was a king who converted to Buddhism. It's a very beautiful story. It's a really lovely story. But he was not writing the canonical works of Buddhism after that. He was somebody who interacted with Buddhists, who was then, said, oh, I really like this belief system. I don't think there's a lot of parallels of people who started off as an antagonist, had a very high, prestigious role. Paul was a direct student of Gamaliel, who was one of the most prestigious Jews ever in history, and certainly in the antiquity period. Why did Paul suddenly switch sides? Why did he give up his career and get jailed and have a life of adversity? I think that's very hard to explain. Moreover, if we look across other religious traditions, we don't see a lot of like pseudo Pauls. We don't see a lot of parallels to Paul. We don't see a lot of Paul-like experiences. In other words, there's no one else who started off as an antagonist and then went on to write formative works within that religion. So I think Paul is actually quite hard to explain. Now, James is maybe a little bit easier to explain. We don't have a lot of writings, but we know that James was not central to the movement and then became very central to the movement. I think that's sort of interesting. I think there's, I found it a little hard to explain. I was talking with a Christian friend of mine about James's conversion, and he made the point that there's a lot of Old Testament narratives that have very, very similar parallels. Like he listed off a bunch more, but the best one I think was Moses and Aaron, right? Where you have the theological figure and then the person who's like doing the groundwork, articulating the case, creating the ministry, and passing it on to other people, right? Aaron was, became the keeper of the temple. And I thought that was a nice analogy. So maybe there's some, sort of Old Testament theological precedent about that. Now, I want to get into the argument that David said, which is not really related as much to the question you're asking me. So I can hold that off until later. But that's an argument around divine hiddenness. And Juan and I got into that on his channel as well. So if you want me to address that, I'm happy to do that. It's sort of down a different pathway of questions. But so I can do that now, or I can hold off and put that.
Can I respond to Tavo's points there before we move, or is that okay?
Okay. Okay. So I tell you what, yeah, because I did have a question follow up for you, David. So,
okay.
Yeah, I tell you what, Tavo, just briefly give your sort of response to David's thing. Then David, I'll let you respond to the points Tavo made. And then
I always say no. It's not my show. I'm just here to throw tomatoes. I'm fine, but I think Tavo makes a lot of claims in his response that are related to the point of the show that I think, there is another perspective that should probably be out there as well.
Okay. So I tell you what, yeah, go ahead and give your responses, but then I do want to ask you a follow up question that's kind of related to what I had
Okay.
discussed with Juan. So yeah.
Okay. All right,
So
Tavo, you had a question. You had a follow-up for me. I'll be brief with mine. So whatever, what did you have?
Well, I think that, the argument from divine hiddenness is essentially what you're appealing to. Why is Jesus not still alive today in Jerusalem, running a throne, and we can all just go talk to him, right? Another way of saying that is why doesn't it say on the moon, Jesus is God, he's the son of God, worship Jesus. Like that would be really way more clear for everybody. And I think that gets into divine hiddenness. But what you're advocating for is, I think, a very, very very, very steep, slippery slope, right? Where there's not a lot of room for evidence or experience in between. Let me give you one example. There are people who will say to you that there's no such thing as divine hiddenness, right? I know people who have directly heard the voice of God, who are Christians, who will testify to me that they know that they have felt the presence of Jesus, they felt the Holy Spirit, they've been spoken to by Jesus and or God, and to them there is no divine hiddenness. And these are very logical, persuasive people. They're all sane individuals, many of whom are respected members of the community that I'm aware of. I know these are people who hold down jobs, and so I think there are people for whom there is no divine hiddenness. There are people like me, right, who demand evidence. Now, I think this creates a challenge, and it creates a tension for the argument between atheists and religious skeptics. Now, I think if you're coming from the standpoint of any theological system, then this is a very difficult challenge. But I think the theology based on Jesus is uniquely able to withstand this tension for a specific reason, and that is because Jesus has a very nice poetry with this, right? Jesus says there are people who come to Jesus who say, I need proof, I need more evidence, I need more signs, and Jesus provides more signs. There are people who come to Jesus exclusively with faith, saying, I believe in you, here's my request. And Jesus acknowledges those people and he celebrates their belief. But Jesus never rejects anyone because they need a higher standard of proof. To me, my whole experience has been very evidence-based. A lot of Christians sort of, in some ways, criticize me for that. And people, including people I know, they're like, your experience with Jesus, with God, should be more personally transformational and less evidence-based. I think that's a legitimate criticism. I think if I were interacting with Jesus in the first century, he would say, you're going to get the sign of the fish and that's it. But I think that Jesus would at least be sympathetic with people on a broad spectrum. So my point is this: the divine hiddenness argument is a rabbit hole we could go down. There's certainly some divine hiddenness, I think, for some people. I think the teachings of Jesus are uniquely able to sort of be resilient or anti-fragile when confronted with arguments of divine hiddenness because of the theology that Jesus espouses. All right, hopefully that wasn't too long-winded. I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah. So I didn't really get a question in there, and so I'm just gonna leave it as a comment. We could do 2 hours on divine hiddenness. My comment wasn't necessarily squarely in divine hiddenness, though. It was more to do with the intent, the mechanism for entering the kingdom. So without faith, it is impossible to please God. And so it is, from the time I was a Christian to the time I stopped being a Christian, I still, as I read my Bible, see faith in the New Testament as the preeminent and perhaps only mechanism, faith alone through grace alone. And so, we have a different perspective on that once again, I'll be happy to debate at some point, but I think is probably slightly off center of the topic here. The comment that you made, though, about the some of the facts about Paul in particular, I would say pretty much all of your facts about Paul rely on the things written in the Bible. It really becomes an entire "the Bible said so" argument. Paul was a persecutor of the church. Really, where did you get that from? Because we know that via the Bible. And what kind of persecution did he do? Well, it depends on who's writing. Um, how did Paul encounter God? Well, that depends on who's writing. Are we going to listen to Luke talking about Paul, or are we going to listen to Paul talking about Paul? Paul is a student of Gamaliel. How do you know that? Oh, well, somebody said it in the book. And, the book is the thing that's in question. And so you can't really use the book to prove the book. Um, so I would just say that maybe in some of the debate that we're talking about, and in some of your own points, there is too much just naked acceptance of whatever the book says about the case, as opposed to, if we're going to make a historical case, finding actual historical uh, uh, non non-biased sources for this.
Can I follow up there, because I think that's your question you're raising. So let's look at Paul, for example, then. And when Juan made his case, right, he tried to say, well, I'm going to give you reasons. His case was specifically the Gospels and Acts, but we could apply the same reasoning to the letters of Paul here,
Mhm.
right? And in that, Paul gives us autobiographical statements as to his inner motivations and desires and his mindset and stuff like that, pre and post conversion. And I think Juan would appeal to evidence like, well, there are these undesigned coincidences. There are the between Paul's letters and Acts of the Apostles, for example, and there are these various indications of reliability where Paul is indicating, hey, I'm not only an eyewitness, I'm an eyewitness trying my best to tell the truth in everything I'm reporting. Um, what would you make about Juan trying to make an argument for the overall general reliability of this eyewitness testimony? Why shouldn't
Luke
we?
was Luke was no Luke was no Josephus. Luke was no historian. There are no works of Luke uh, in the annals of history. So let's call Luke what he was. He was a theologian. Um, he was a Jesus booster, and maybe he was well read and well liked. But to call him a historian is just, I have no idea what you're calling, what criteria you're using to say that Luke is a historian in the same breath that you would say Josephus is a historian. Secondly, I think the undesigned coincidences would happen in the same way they would happen in my writing. So if I were writing about something that happened 50 years ago, um, I was actually around 50 years ago. If I was writing about something that happened 80 years ago, which is probably uh, closer to Luke. But that said, if I was doing that, I would do it with a lot of verisimilitude, because I would look at the sources that wrote most extensively about that. These days in scholarship, there is a very strong, very loud drumbeat that is starting to build, and cases have been made, which I find compelling, that Luke knew Josephus' work and used Josephus' work. And the reason you get a lot of historical accuracy about things like geography and the time it takes to go from this port to this port or whatever is because he was picking it up from someone who knew. It's not evidence that he was there. And again, I'm not prepared to make that case, but I'd say that case is out there being made by high-level scholars that when you compare the various texts, it seems like Luke had a copy of Josephus, not merely a copy of Mark.
Okay, so just before I get Tavo's take, and we do have a couple of relevant audience questions afterwards, but just kind of curious, because when I discussed with Juan, I went on the call-in show, and Juan, as a skeptic, admitted that, look, once we start granting, if you could establish through a maximal facts approach that the accounts of Paul's conversion in Acts were true, like all of the secondary details. The his companion saw it. He went blind for 3 days afterwards. I remember asking Juan if we took each element step by step. So Paul has an appearance. Do you believe that can be explained away naturally? He said yes. Then I said, okay, well, now we posit that he went blind for 3 days. And he went, no, that's too far. It requires a miracle to explain that. I'm just kind of curious. So at what point of granting these facts would you say we have to appeal to a miracle? Or
I don't grant any of the facts that Luke gives. I think that Luke is a bad actor, and to the extent that he's trying to write history, he's a bad historian. And there's zero people back in the time who would have called Luke a historian. That's like calling me a historian. I'm a writer. I've probably written more than Luke. I'm not a historian. I've been a news writer. Okay, I've done that. But to call me a historian would be stupid simply because I write about something that happened in the past that I believe in. That's not what makes a historian. So Luke has more interesting things to say about Paul and his conversion than Paul does, which is also very suspicious. There's a progression of that story, so it's mentioned 3 times in Acts, and it's different every time. You talk about Paul's companions. We don't hear a word from Paul's companions, so we don't know if Paul even had any companions or whether that road to Damascus experience ever happened, because Paul never mentions it, which is super weird that Paul never mentions the thing that brought him to God in the first place. But if we look at the details of that story, sometimes his companions, give it in the camera, his companions hear a noise but don't know what it is. Maybe they see something, but they don't know it. They cannot, in fact, corroborate anything that Paul of that story said. They are witnesses to nothing. If you put them on the witness stand, they would be shrugging their shoulders and say, I don't know, I heard this noise and Paul was on the ground. Then, he was a Christian. He said, we got to go to see Ananias. Okay, so we went. That's all you would ever get up out of them. You would not put these fools, whoever these anonymous fools are, on a stand. They witnessed nothing, and that's taking the facts from the story that I don't believe in the first place. How on earth do you build anything out of that?
Okay, so just to clarify, because obviously, when I was the resurrection skeptic, as you know, I agree with you. I think the only thing we could that I granted the historicity of was that Paul had an appearance that he thought was the risen Jesus, and that was it. So I didn't grant blindness or the companions or any of that. But just for clarity, though, if the story in Acts is true, if you're like, yeah, everything it says that happened, do you think that could still be explained naturally, or would you be like, well, that does
Yes.
require a miracle?
Yeah, no, heck no. I cannot count in my travels and readings, mostly readings because I haven't traveled that much, the number of people in contemporary times who've complained, who have complained, who have suggested that they have seen Jesus, who've had an appearance of Jesus. Open the door up to NDAs. Look at the number of people who keep swooshing up to heaven to get hugs and kisses from Jesus. It's so gross. In fact, some of the stories that you get from these people. Now, did they have some kind of experience? Probably. Did they bump their head? Quite possibly. Did they get an appearance from Jesus? I have no idea why I would believe that. And I know some of these people. I have talked to some of these people. I've appeared in programs with some of these people. And so you don't need a miracle to explain any of these stories, and you can take their testimony at face value. You're asking me to accept the testimony from a known fabulist like Luke, pretending to be a historian, saying things about Paul that Paul doesn't say about himself, and giving conflicting stories that do not amount to anything miraculous. I don't need a miracle to explain any of that any more than I need a miracle to explain why the neighbor 2 doors down saw Jesus yesterday.
All right. Tavo, I want to let you have your say on the appearance of the Apostle Paul, and obviously there was a difference between my resurrection skepticism. I'm more in tune with what David Johnson is saying. Okay, I'll grant he had an appearance. I don't deny that, but I'm not going to grant Juan everything else about him going blind for 3 days and Ananias having a vision and just happened to come in and heal him and all of these secondary details. So so what's your take on the debate on the Apostle Paul between Juan and I on that front?
Well, yeah, before I go into that, let me just make an observation here, which I think is going to be really poignant and very important. We're an hour into the debate. I started this debate with two very simple questions. Why did the resurrection proclamation happen? And why was it compelling? Right? Now, we've drifted into a lot of other very ancillary statements. We've drifted into Paul wasn't an antagonist. We have no verification of that. Luke was a known fabulist. Luke was copying from Josephus. And we're drifting into a lot of things, none of which really address those two questions. And my whole argument is, if you can't address those two questions, then, and we can get into comparisons, people with near-death experiences having experiences with Jesus, and why that's similar and why it's dissimilar, but I don't know that really erodes any of those points. I think, I don't know that if you grant, but let's get a little more focused and let's at least refer to some of the things that have been said about Paul. If you're arguing that Paul was never an antagonist or that Paul didn't exist, you're way outside of the historical consensus. Okay?
I didn't say that he didn't exist, but I'm not outside of historical consensus when I say that he wasn't, that we have no evidence that he was an antagonist. The only thing we have for that is the Bible. We certainly have no evidence that he was a student. That he was a student from Gamaliel or anything like that.
Okay, well,
one last thing before you get back. My comments are very much in keeping with the show that we're doing, which is a review show of Juan and Dale's debate. And so I came in prepared to discuss that in whatever avenues it takes. And as we have a chance to bring up some of the things that you're talking about, that would be great. If we need to do a separate show to focus on those things, that would be great. But if it seems like I'm not focusing on the things that you want me to focus on, it's because I'm focusing on the things that I was asked to focus on when I came here.
Yeah, I mean, and let me address some of the things that you're saying specifically. So is it outside of the historical consensus to say that we don't have any reliable documents outside of scriptural references that describe Saul of Tarsus as initially being antagonistic? Okay. The answer is no. Okay. We do have resources. They're outside of scripture, but they're not as reliable. I'll grant you that. But the point is, virtually, I don't know of any scholar in any mainstream who won't say that Paul was Saul of Tarsus. He was initially an antagonist. He was initially a persecutor, and he switched sides at some point and became a follower of Jesus. I think to sort of argue against those points is at least way outside of the historical consensus.
No, I think it's surprising because you don't get a lot of pushback
let me finish, because I mean you talked for a long time. I feel like I should address some of these points that you brought up. I mean, otherwise we're not going to.
Sure, I understand that, but I mean, you're saying things about Paul, and historians do not say that Paul is an antagonist, but they also don't spend a lot of time fighting the issue because it's a non-issue. Part of what we know about Christian testimony today, I've seen much of it, is to kind of show your credentials of how bad of a person you were or how low of a person you were before being lifted up by Jesus. This is a very long and storied history of testimony. And so a lot of people say, well, Paul wouldn't have any reason to make that up. Oh, yes, he would, because that's a major part of his resume.
All right, so Tavo, I'll let you respond to that, and then I want to try to bring us back on track by looking at my opening case. So yeah, go ahead and respond to the Paul, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, I mean, and I also really want to respond to Luke as a known fabulist, way outside of historical consensus, way outside of a scholarly opinion. I mean, I'm happy to put that on the side for now, but I mean, but we do have other documentation of Saul of Tarsus. For instance, we have the Toledo Yeshu. Now, that argues explicitly that Saul of Tarsus was actually a double agent, and it uses very exculpatory language around Paul specifically, right? That suggests that the Toledo Yeshu was at least based on some oral understanding from, it probably was the oral core of the Toledo Yeshu, probably came into existence sometime in the 2nd century, probably developing from earlier oral traditions, that there was some nucleus of Paul being a member of the Sanhedrin, being somebody who was on the side of justice, on the side of divinity in that situation. Right now, I don't know that it merits going further down this rabbit hole if we're granting these facts that Paul was an antagonist, that he did have a conversion experience. And I understand your point. Modern Christians will often say, I was a really terrible person, and then I had a conversion experience. But that doesn't necessarily disprove what Paul said, right? If you're, I guess I'm saying, why are we even talking about this? Because we know that the historical consensus is that Paul existed, that he was an advocate for Jesus, and he started off as Saul of Tarsus, and he started off from an antagonistic lens. So if you're granting those things, that's the very core of the argument that I'm saying. So I think it just muddies the waters to say, well, do we really know this?
I don't recall myself granting anything, but I believe the thing that you're really responding to was my accusation, if you want to call it that, my claim that all of your claims are based on the Bible says so, and not actually on historical scholarship.
They're based on historical scholarship, and they're based on the Jewish sources. But I don't know that this rabbit hole is productive to go down, because all the historical sources acknowledge that Paul existed, acknowledge that Paul was Saul of Tarsus, that Paul was an antagonist, and then he became a Christian. I think those facts alone.
None of that is hard to explain. None of that requires a miracle. Part of your argument was you just couldn't get here without a miracle, or it would be very hard to explain any of this without a miracle. We haven't even come anywhere in the neighborhood of something requiring a miracle.
I want to turn it back over to Dale. Go ahead, Dale.
Yeah. So, okay. Just a very quick follow-up for you then, Tavo, because I asked David about the mechanistic argument. So in my hypothesis, I granted everything you did, because I think these are historical facts that the vast majority of scholars will accept, kind of thing. But I also denied, which is controversial, that Paul had a mindset. He wasn't experiencing cognitive dissonance or any kind of sympathies towards Christianity. But I said, even if that's the case, there's still an equally probable naturalistic explanation through a hallucination induced not because of his psychology, but because of external environmental factors. So, for example, maybe he had a sunstroke induced hallucination, right? He was dehydrated, exhausted, traveling on the road to Damascus to persecute those Christians. So he has Jesus on his mind and stuff, and he suffers a sunstroke, and that has been known to induce a hallucination. And this is something that Dr. Craig Keener has said could explain what happened with Paul. If all we have is he had an appearance, do you think a mechanism like that is an equally probable explanation? Or what's your take on my theory that I offer?
And throw in stroke or amulism. Aneurysm, there's a storm, lightning strikes, he's scared, causes a stroke, he sees visions, he's in the second heaven. This is all stuff that happens. It's not, so my thing would be, it seems like the only thing that the Christian doesn't consider with the Paul story are the multiplicity of natural explanations. That's the only thing that can't be discussed, and it has to be a miracle. And I'm just saying, we're jumping past so many natural explanations for mundane details that happen every day that don't suggest a miracle.
Yeah. Well, like I said, let's let Tavo respond, because I in the debate, I provided my own, what I think is a good mechanism. So, what was your take on that before we kind of move on from Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I can. So here's my problem: is if you're saying there's any number of natural explanations, then you don't have a natural explanation. What you have is hand waving, right? And that has zero explanatory power in my book. If you're just saying Paul might have had some sort of naturalistic experience that could have induced a vision, yeah, then what's the experience? What's the information? How did it induce a theological change? Now, we have to be really careful when we use this phraseology. Could Paul have had a hallucination at some point in his experiences? Yeah, anyone could have a hallucination, but a hallucination is not a delusion, right? A hallucination is a false sensory experience. Now, nobody else should have any experiences around that. So if anyone other than Paul has that experience, then the whole argumentation breaks down. Number two, hallucinations are almost always congruent with our native theological experiences. Now, our framework, our worldview, those inform our hallucinations, right? You're never going to have a hallucination that results in a change in a fundamental core belief. Now, moreover, if this was some sort of a state of delirium, if it was a stroke, a transient ischemic attack, if it was some other sort of neurological event, then the problem is when that neurological event subsides, it does not leave behind a false belief, right? If you have a delirium, that is by definition not an organic psychosis. It cannot be. It's a mutually exclusive definition, right? So if Paul had some delirium, if he had sunstroke, if he had some metabolic problem, if there was some other thing that happened, then that explains a delirium, but it doesn't explain a change in beliefs, right? What happens with delirium is it's a time-limited sort of situation where you have temporally limited altered mental status, right? That doesn't explain why you have a fixed belief. So the best explanation that I've heard from Paul's experience was from Paulogia, and it's not a very good explanation, but his argument is that there was cognitive dissonance because Paul had symptoms of guilt and he had feelings of guilt, and this resulted in him having a theological shift. Here's the problem with that explanation. We have about 20,000 Nazis who persecuted the Jews. None of them converted to Judaism. We have various other members of other populations. We have people who are persecuting Muslims right now who are Buddhists, right? They're tremendously persecutory of the native Muslim populations in many countries throughout the Pacific Rim. None of those people have conversion experiences. None of those people have lifelong experiences with guilt. So again, I'm okay with saying there could have been a cause, but then what's that cause? And if you don't have one, if you're just hand waving, it could have been an aneurysm, it could have been a stroke. Well, we don't have anything that is congruent with those explanations. And moreover, we don't have any evidence that people will have theological shifts. The closest thing we have is maybe Gershon syndrome, which is where people have a theological fixation. But again, that's generally not a fixation that alters their worldviews. So you still have a lot of unexplained things. So now if you're saying I can explain Paul, if Paul is the only evidence that you have, right? And you're saying, well, I can explain Paul through some naturalistic mechanism. We don't need to induce theology to explain the conversion experience of Paul. I would actually agree with that, right? If all I had was Paul saying I had a conversion experience, that wouldn't be enough alone to sell me on the divinity of Jesus. The point is where it fits in the constellation, the disciples being transformed, the region of Judea being transformed, many Jewish people who are realigning with the values of Christianity, people who are willing to undergo very unpleasant experiences, being jailed, being killed. Then it becomes sort of a constellation that's harder to argue against. So yeah, we could spend 2 hours arguing about Paul specifically. I don't think that would get us anywhere. And moreover, we'd leave the rest of the evidence on the table. A theological explanation around Paul is not convincing by itself, but you have to put together
a constellation of unconvincing arguments is just an unconvincing constellation.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's my point. Yeah.
Cool. So so now we can move on from Paul. So I wanted to get your take on that, but it does lead into, okay, let's focus on my opening. And I first want to get your guys' take on my strategy, because I have noticed, so Tavo, I'm starting with you here. My goal was just to provide an undercutting defeater, right? So I kind of argued, look, if I can provide, I don't have to prove my naturalistic hypothesis is true, that Paul actually had a sunstroke hallucination, or that the 12 actually had this mass hallucination experience. My goal is just to provide an equally probable explanation that's natural, fully natural, and therefore that would defeat Juan's claim as the Christian. He's the one claiming the positive claim. I know the resurrection's true, and I can prove it on a balance of probabilities. If at least just one. My strategy was to say there's at least one fully natural hypothesis that's equally probable, and that defeats a claim that you can say, well, the resurrection hypothesis is more probable than not. And I used the odds form of Bayes' theorem to try and do that. I'm just kind of curious in terms of my overall strategy. First of all, do you think that was a good strategy, or am I crazy? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I thought that was a good strategy. Again, it sort of comes down to like, do you have one explanation that has a lot of explanatory power for a lot of different things, or do you have about 30 or 40 different explanations, each of which seem pretty unlikely in and of themselves? To me, now the use of Bayes' theorem became very interesting in your debate with Juan, because then you went into like this kind of rabbit hole over whether or not you're using Bayes' theorem correctly. Now, as somebody who's an editor for several different journals in a very academic field, which is very different, I love Bayes' theorem, but I always have it when I know what the pretest probability is. I think one of the problems with the application of Bayes' theorem to theological debates is the pretest probabilities vary so wildly. So I prefer to use likelihood ratio when I do my calculations around these issues. But can you just shed some light on what you said? I think you said at some point in the debate that there was an error in Bayes' theorem that you would use, that you would invoke some error and you would be clarifying it later. Am I misrecalling what you said in your debate with
Oh, yeah. So with respect to the prior probability factors, I provided a couple of arguments that I think makes the prior probability low. And at the end of the day, it was so low, it didn't really matter how good the resurrection hypothesis came across based on the evidence. It was still not going to be strong enough to overcome those low prior odds, and that was kind of the main point I was trying to get across there. And yeah, we can discuss, the next thing we'll go to is the prior odds, and I'll discuss what I see as the errors are. But before I do that, David J, I know how much you love math. I'm just kind of curious on your take on my general strategy, what I was trying to do as my way to win the debate, if possible. Did you think that was a good way, or yeah?
So there are two things. One, I feel like you stole one of my shticks, which is to grant as many ridiculous things as possible and then prove that the case is still weak. With my series on apologetics, I can grant all of the apologetics as written, and you still don't get Jesus. You don't get the God of the Bible. You don't get there. So I mean, that's boring. But I love the game. Just if we're talking about intellectual debate games, I'll grant you 80% of your argument on any argument you want, and I'll still win. I will play poker with you with 3 of my cards face up, and I will still win because you don't have a hand. So I liked the audaciousness of how much you were willing to grant to just take off the table. So I don't know if it was smart. I don't know if it's smart when I do it, but it was fun. So that would be my first thing. But the second thing is you had to go and ruin it with Bayes. So this was uniquely you. And on the one hand, I appreciated you doing it because there could be nothing more for anyone watching that debate. There's nothing more authentic to Dale. His magnus opus, when he's ready to hang it up, is going to be on his Bayes theorem thing. And so to see you kind of take that and use Bayes against the thing that you believe, it practically brought a tear to my eye. It was extremely authentic and honest and vulnerable, and maybe dumb, but it was the thing, I think, in the end that won me over, and that might cause me as a referee to give the decision to you, just because of the audaciousness of the move. Anyone who does not know Dale well and does not know where Bayes fits into his whole life scheme, you missed the impact of that whole section.
Yeah, that's interesting, because when we get to the second, as David know, and I kind of admitted in the debate, there was a few days where, or to a week, where it was possible I might lose my faith. And it was precisely for this reason that I'm arguing the thing. It was based on Lydia McGrew kind of convincing me that I was wrong in how the prior probabilities were calculated. And instead, she was convincing me that they were so low. Look, I could have been convinced on the shroud 99.99999%, or the historical evidence for the resurrection 99.9999%. It's still not going to be enough to overcome those low prior odds. And, I was concerned, because I was like, well, I'm still a Christian at heart. I still believe there's such great evidence for the resurrection and stuff. But if I have to be intellectually consistent, I have to factor in these prior probabilities. I can't just ignore them. And it was such an odd experience, because David, as an atheist, was the one trying to convince me, no, just keep your Christianity. Don't worry about that stuff. And it was the Christians almost trying to talk me out of my faith, so to speak. Again, that's not a fair thing, because they've been very helpful in talking through the issues with me and stuff behind the scenes. But that's where I kind of realized the error, as Tavo, you were saying, where those factors that I bring on with the prior odds actually aren't good. They don't establish that the prior probability is low for the resurrection. So I was right in terms of my assigning the 50-50 as the priors, and I'm more confident now than I ever was before. So I'm kind of glad I went through those intellectual doubts, because it has solidified that. But just for the audience who has no clue what am I talking about, in the debate, I presented two prior probability arguments, and maybe
just a real breakthrough. I'm getting up again. I'm going to go ahead and mute myself, but you can look at the mute button to see when I get back.
And maybe again, I don't know how much David and Tavo would be interested in discussing this, but maybe we could spend 10 minutes or something on it. But these were important to me. So number one, my argument was, look, God has rams galore, right? So I'm granting God exists, and he would have, in certain contexts where a religion can be authenticated, a religion authenticating context is present, God could have performed any number of miracles. He didn't have to raise Jesus from the dead in order to authenticate that he is the Messiah or God in the flesh. He could have performed an ascension. I think that was another example of a miracle we've mentioned. Or even granting, okay, for some reason God had to raise Jesus from the dead. He could have raised Jesus differently, in a different mode than he did, right? He could have done it through light, through particle radiation, as Bob Rucker argues. He could have done it with Jesus wearing a pink tutu, or, there were different ways God could have raised Jesus from the dead and still accomplished his goal of authenticating Jesus's religious message. And so that was my first argument. I said, well, what are the odds that God would choose to raise Jesus in the way he did? It's very low, 1 in 1,000. The second argument, and this is the one that was causing me trouble personally during that, when I was having those intellectual doubts, was the rams galore argument. And that's saying that, well, look, even when a religion authenticating context is present, such as in Jesus' post-death case, 9 times out of 10, when a religion authenticating context is present, God doesn't choose to perform a miracle. Instead, he's hands off. He lets you be convinced by the persuasiveness of the preacher or the work of the Holy Spirit, as we know as Christians, influencing you and giving you a properly basic belief. When Christian missionary, there's a religion authenticating context right here during this podcast as we speak. I'm here, me and Tavo want to convince you of the resurrection. Imagine how amazing it would be if God performed a miracle right here live for everybody. Is he going to do it? I don't see any miracles happening. So the argument is 9 times out of 10, even when a religion authenticating context is present, God chooses not to perform religion authenticating miracles. So it will be low that he would want to do it in Jesus' case. So those were the arguments I gave. And before I give my take as to why this was an erroneous argument, these are stupid arguments, I now realize. Tavo, I'll start with you. Like, what was your take on these prior odds arguments? Were you persuaded for any second that I was right, that the resurrection hypothesis is extremely improbable?
I don't want to say no, I wasn't persuaded at all because I thought it was a good argument.
Okay.
I think it's more rhetorically persuasive when you hear it, and it becomes less compelling after you sort of think about it for a while. But I thought it was a good argument. Here are some of the things I liked about it is it does sort of make a point that I think that point is again more towards divine hiddenness. Why isn't there just sort of an easy button that I can hit that so I yeah, I mean, I thought it was a good argument. I liked Juan's response that like if you get really granular about every single detail, then every event becomes astronomically impossible. I wrote a paper some years ago where I talked about the cosmology of the universe and if time and space are infinite, right, then probability has to be infinitesimal for any single event, right? And that means that essentially nothing can ever happen. I mean, it was a logical paradox argument, but I really enjoyed that paper. But that's the perspective is that if you get really granular about every event, what are the odds that any event is going to happen in a universe where possibility is infinite? By definition, if time and space is infinite, then possibility must be infinite, and that means that really nothing can ever happen because everything is infinitesimally probable. So, but I liked Juan's response that you can't get too granular with these things. I don't know that I would agree that 9 times out of 10 a religion authenticating miracle doesn't happen. Um, no, this again depends really narrowly on how you define it, though, right? I know. I gave a talk at this sort of men's sobriety halfway house. Now we know that in the literature that if you're Christian and if you're part of a theological program, then you have a lower risk of criminal recidivism and you have a lower risk of substance abuse relapse. Okay, we know that definitively. It's very clearly borne out in the literature. But I met this guy who was like, he was a hardcore addict to an illicit substance. I don't want to give too many identifying details about him, but and he felt an experience with the Holy Spirit where he prayed for God to heal him of his addiction, and he never used a single day after that. He didn't require anything. So is that a religion authenticating miracle? I don't know. I think if you count those, then you come up with a ratio that's higher than 9 times out of 10. This gets back to Alex O'Connor's really wonderful argument, and he's not his argument originally, but why doesn't God show up to why is there such a thing as non-resistant non-belief? And we'll never know how often somebody is non-resistant and a non-believer for their entire life, pursuing God, pursuing cosmology, pursuing divinity through a purely neutral lens, and God never appears to them. We do know that most of the people who are the most vocal atheists, David, right, in this debate, Matt Dillahunty, Bart Ehrman, they start off as theological scholars, right? They start off from a theological lens, and many, many atheists fall into this category. And they say, God appeared to Paul. Why is God not appearing to me? How am I any less worthy than Paul? Now, I think that's a lens that lacks humility. But yeah, when you make that demand to God, when you say, God, appear to me, I deserve to see you as much as Paul did. I'll tell you, I'll be very honest with you. I will probably never have a transcendent or transformative experience with the Holy Spirit. I'm just not, I've had, and some people who know my story.
Never say never.
Maybe not never, but some people who know more about my story. I was diagnosed with a terminal malignancy, and I had leukocytoclastic vasculitis. I had a lot of neurological symptoms. Everything was temporary, and I got much better, and I didn't have any lasting neurological deficits. And thanks be to the whatever for that, But the point is this: if why didn't God appear to me then? I was an atheist. There's no atheist in foxholes, right? Well, I was in the foxhole, and I came out of it an atheist. So my point is this: I think if you look more broadly for religion authenticating miracles, I think conceivably the subjective experiences of people are more broad. I will say one more experience that I had. Somebody showed me a CT scan in a patient with widely metastatic renal malignancy, right? And they showed me another CT scan months later, and I was like, okay, well, this is like the before scan before this patient got malignancy. And they were like, nope, that's the after scan, and everything was gone. Now, this was a Catholic individual who prayed a lot, I happen to know. But is that a religion authenticating miracle? To that individual, it probably is. I remain sort of agnostic on that question. I know that a spontaneous regression of malignancies can occur. It's exceedingly uncommon, but it can occur. So I guess it depends on how you define miracle. For that person, it's probably a miracle. For me, it was a fascinating case. And I was an atheist at the time, by the way, and I remained an atheist after I saw that set of scans. Anyways.
Awesome. Yeah, and interesting to know. So yeah, you did think that these are, at least at the very least in the moment, that these were arguments that succeeded in showing the resurrection hypothesis was improbable. So okay, all right, cool. But again,
I think the measure of success for your debate was, do you get people more interested in the questions? And I think in that argument, in that regards, now I think your points were rhetorically persuasive, and then Juan's points were rhetorically persuasive. So I thought it was a rhetorically persuasive argument in the moment, but I think it made me think more about it, and I thought that was really the real strength of it. I think, yeah.
Awesome. Okay, cool. And so before it comes to me, and I want to give the answers that again, and I thank Dr. Lydia McGrew and Jonathan McLatchie and others as well. He brings on others so much for helping me work out these issues behind the scenes. So I can't wait to give what the answers are. But before I do, David Johnson, I'm kind of curious, what did you make of the specific arguments I gave? I didn't want to just give some argument that I think was BS. Let me appeal to David Hume. His argument is garbage. I'm not going to lie and pretend like that's good. But these were arguments that I thought were better, at least more plausible in providing lower odds for the resurrection miracle. What were your thoughts on my two prior probability arguments?
Yeah, I agree with Tavo for the first 2 minutes of him talking. Maybe not so much after that, but I think as he was addressing that particular question, it's pretty much exactly the way I would have answered it. I think that it's a rhetorical win in the moment. It's not one that ages well, though. And I thought that Juan did a very good job of kind of taking that apart. But I actually think that Juan could have gone further. I mean, I think I would have, again, putting a Christian hat on, I would have addressed it slightly differently. I would have said, I don't really give a crap what the odds are. 1 in a trillion. Cool. Are those the odds? Even better. Make them bigger, because the bigger your odds, then the easier it is for me to say, but it happened, therefore God. God did it. God doesn't care about your odds. God can act regardless of the probability. God can act regardless of his past actions. God can act regardless of whether it's a religious authenticating experience or not. God chooses to do what God chooses to do when God chooses to do it, and it cannot be nailed down with a formula or with human reason or with what seems to make sense at the time. And so I would just bypass that entire line of argument that you made altogether by saying, you're probably right. Odds are against it. That's why we call them miracles. Next.
Fair enough. Okay, so, and just before I do, I thanked Dr. Lydia McGrew and Jonathan McLatchie for their help. I also want to thank you, David J., because I also consulted you behind the scenes and just you let me sort of talk things out about these issues. So you were also helpful in me arriving at these answers and preserving my Christian faith. So I also, as weird as it sounds, I'm thanking you as an atheist, but yeah, just letting me talk them out.
I appreciate that. That's something that I would never bring up myself. And if anyone wants to ask me about that conversation, ask away. I will never answer. Dale and I talk about a lot of things. We have the kind of relationship where we can be vulnerable or irascible or whatever we need to be, and we can do that. And so that kind of thing happens.
All right, cool. So here are the answers that you've all been waiting for. Why do my prior probability arguments, they suck? They don't work at all. They don't show that the resurrection hypothesis is improbable at all. So let's start with the first argument, but part B, where I said, well, God could have given God chooses to raise Jesus from the dead as the miracle. He could have raised him wearing a pink tutu. He could have raised him in, using particle radiation. He could have raised him using light. There are all these different ways he could have done a resurrection miracle.
Would you believe that he did? Because you're a shrouding. So that was one of my first thoughts. You're talking about all of the shroud stuff in that, and I thought, yeah, okay, I know where this comes from.
So, and that's where this objection came from my work on the shroud, right? Where we get into the hypothesis at stake might get into certain specifics. But here, it's totally irrelevant. The hypothesis is simply the resurrection hypothesis. It doesn't specify the mode or how. So all of the different ways, however God raised Jesus, if he's risen, that's the success of the hypothesis. So it's the wrong reference class. It doesn't lower the odds at all. It doesn't matter. And a great example given to me by Dr. Lydia McGrew is, what's the hypothesis that I'm going to choose ice cream, that I'm going to choose ice cream from the grocery store? Well, it's not like, they have 36 flavors, so therefore there's a 1 divided by 36 chance that you're going to pick ice cream. No. No matter what flavor I get, it's all ice cream kind of thing. Now, if the hypothesis was more specific, if it's what's the prior probability I'm going to choose chocolate ice cream, that's where the number of flavors would become relevant, background knowledge. But if the hypothesis is general, what's the odds I'm going to buy ice cream? It doesn't matter whether I buy chocolate, vanilla, strawberry. It's all proving the truth of the hypothesis. So that's the answer to the first objection there. It's just irrelevant, the specificity of how God raised Jesus from the dead. Now, what about but doesn't God, as an omnipotent God, have different things? Pretend he did a religion authenticating miracle that wasn't a resurrection. Maybe he did a bodily ascension like Hercules, or an assumption into heaven, or some other miracle that wasn't a resurrection miracle. Wouldn't that have equally achieved his goal of authenticating Christianity or Jesus's message? And this is where Juan was bang on with his answer in the debate. I was very proud of him, and I think I even had to concede defeat to him in the debate.
You actually broke character to pat him on the back there. It was unnecessary. We all saw it.
There were some character breaks in the debate. Yeah.
Sorry, I shouldn't have done that. But still, it was that's the correct answer, because all of these other options are not equally probable given the background knowledge, the specific religion. The specific way that God had to give a post-death vindication miracle. And I kept it vague like that as the background evidence on purpose. But once we have that in light of the Jewish biblical Old Testament background, whereby Jesus's mission is to solve the problem of sin and death, the resurrection is the only mode of the miracle which would authenticate his mission and therefore his religious message. God couldn't have done a bodily assumption. Christianity would be false the biblical scriptures would be false if that was the mode of his miracle. Jesus would not have been the Jewish Messiah. First, it would violate messianic prophecies, but it would violate the whole point of the Christian religion, kind of thing. So that was the answer from Juan, is that no, it's 100%. It's a 0% probability, given the biblical background knowledge, that God could have done some other non-resurrection miracle to authenticate Jesus. So that's the answer right there. And that's what Juan said, just by saying it's not true. All the other options are equally probable. And yeah, he is absolutely correct. There's actually a 0% probability he could have done those other miracles. Does that make sense, Tavo and David, on that front?
Yeah. I think that was. I mean, it was a nice point in the debate. I thought probably on the argumentation, Juan won that part of the argument.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but quick shout out though to Juan, I think, who's in the chat, and I hope he has other questions. And then also quick shout out to James, who's in the chat as well. 21st Century Apologetics, and also shout out to Skeptic Philosophy, great channel. We've been on some shows together. I think, if I'm thinking the right person, and I've checked out a lot of your videos. So I'm glad you're here. I hope you'll ask some questions in the chat as well. And if there's anyone else watching from my channel, I hope you check out my content too, and I hope you check out some of the other content on a lot of the channels of the people who are chiming in. They all have really, really great stuff, including David, by the way. Really great channel, David.
Yeah. Awesome. All right, cool. So last but not least, and then we can move on, but this is the most important thing. This was the one, again, that was causing me those intellectual doubts. My second argument, to ram or not to ram kind of thing, right? where God, look, 9 times out of 10, a religion authenticating context can be established or proven to exist, and yet God doesn't perform a miracle. So, Tavo, I think you kind of said, well, it's not that simplistic. You'd have to actually do the calculation. So maybe it's something like 7 out of 10 times or 6 out of 10 times or something like that. It's not necessarily 9 out of 10. Cool. That's a possible answer I considered and stuff like that maybe it's not as implausible or improbable as I was saying. But the main objection as to why it doesn't matter at all is because the religion authenticating context itself is insufficient to prove that God is motivated to perform a ram. It's got to have at least these 2 elements. And here comes the Molinism, David. I know you're going to love this, right? So God's ultimate goal is for as many free will human beings to achieve their ultimate purpose in creation as possible. And within a Christian context, that's called salvation, right? So he wants to save as many free will creatures from damnation as possible. So the fulfillment of the goal of authenticating the religion has to be consistent with his second goal. So there are 2 elements that need to be established. Number 1, there's a religion authenticating context present. That's pretty easy to prove. And number 2, that performing the miracle, that will be conducive to saving as many free will creatures as possible. Determining that is impossible for human beings. It's inscrutable for finite human beings. Only the Molinistic God, who is omniscient, would be able to know, okay, am I going to achieve this ultimate goal? If I perform this resurrection in Jesus' case here and now, that will be conducive to saving as many free will creatures. Therefore, I'm motivated to do that. But right here on the podcast, we have no idea. If God did perform some kind of miracle to authenticate Christianity, it could be less souls will be saved as a result. And only God, an omniscient God, knows that will be the end result. So that's the main answer. It's an incomplete reference class. Just saying, well, let me compare all of the times a religion authenticating context is present or provable, and then compare the number of times God doesn't do a miracle versus does. That's irrelevant. That's incomplete for proving God was actually motivated. So that's the answer. That's why that alone is irrelevant. And Dr. Lydia McGrew, I love you, but you're wrong. It is 50-50. It is just, we are in this agnostic state. We don't know whether God is motivated or not, because we can't ascertain the end result, whether or not God's ultimate goal will happen or not when he produces a religion authenticating miracle in any specific situation. So that's the answer. Tavo and David, what do you guys think?
Let me jump in, since everybody who knows me knows what I'm going to say. I think it's the height of hubris and foolishness to suggest that you know what God wants at any given moment, period. But you see, I would take it a step further than you, because you believe that you know what God's ultimate goal is. And I would say it's the height of hubris to think that you know God's ultimate goal either. The God of the Bible is, and you said this in your speech just now, he said basically, but basically you said he's inscrutable. And I would say that's your whole speech. Just stop there. Perfect. Chef's kiss. The God of the Bible is inscrutable. And so if you think you know what he wants in any given situation at any given moment in time, uh, you're bonkers, because all you have to do is read the Bible and look at some of his actions, and you would say, man, I don't think that would be the right answer in any situation for anything. So the fact that he did this thing at all should be enough to say this God is inscrutable. I think he's as inscrutable as the Muslim God. Uh, Christians do not go that far, but I think that's really the only place you can go. Otherwise, you're left in a position of saying that you know the mind of God, and you don't.
All right, and yeah, Tavo, any thoughts on that on your end, or
Yeah, let me think for a second here. So, I don't know that it's as simplistic as God is inscrutable or God isn't. I think Molinism is a fascinating issue. I don't necessarily believe in human free will, just meaning that I think it's something that definitionally has a lot of problems with it if we talk about free will. I think moral agency is maybe a better definition of it. Now, if God puts a choice in front of me and I decide which of those two things I'm going to do, which of those paths I'm going to go down, um, if God knows the answer, does that deprive me of free will? I think generally my argument is no, I still have the free will in that case. Now, that's not a total reconciliation of some of the paradoxes of Molinism, but again, maybe that's a topic for another day. But getting back to the topic of can we know the will of God? I mean, I don't know that it's 100% inscrutable. I think we can't know the ultimate plan in some regards, but I think for instance, people who are using a lot of drugs. I think you could say, is that that if you're using drugs, is that God's will that you destroy your body with drugs? I think most people would say, if there is a God, that's probably not God's will. So I think there are some limitations in the inscrutability argument. Should you walk around lying or stabbing or hurting people? Is that God's will? I think the answer is again, probably not. That's not. I think there are some things that we can say that are within the confines of scrutability rather than lack of knowing. But, I don't know where I would draw that fuzzy line of distinction. Now, there's certainly a lot of subversion of expectations in the New Testament, right? That happens throughout, but I don't know that that's the same as inscrutability.
yeah, fair enough. And look, I didn't say God is inscrutable in terms of his motivations. I think I know what it is. He reveals it to us, so it's easy to know.
True, yeah, yeah.
Save as many free will souls as possible. That's
Yeah.
his ultimate goal. He tells us that, or at the very least, one of his ultimate goals. So, but in terms of all the nooks and crannies, that's inscrutable to us. Like in making predictions based on all the causal chain. If I eat a cookie right now, can you tell me what's going to happen 200 years from now and all of the causal chains that are cause and effects that are connected to my choosing to eat a cookie? No human being can. That's inscrutable to us, but it's not inscrutable to an omniscient God. And that's what I'm saying. So he knows that by performing a ram here and now or not, what all of the causal chains will lead up to uh, end with his end result or achieving his end result or not. And obviously, I'm presupposing libertarian free will. It's not going to work out if we deny if you go for some kind of compatibilism or determinism. I will admit that my answer doesn't work then. But yeah, cool. So I think that covers it for the prior probability stuff. Yeah, and we covered Paul and James a bit. So what do you guys think of my getting into the historical case, my naturalistic theory? Let's talk about for phase one, first of all, right? So that covers the facts starting with Jesus' crucifixion up until the women. So Peter there's the empty tomb. Peter had his individual hallucination, a grief-induced post-bereavement one, just like Pelagia and everybody else says. I think that works for an individual. And then the women having an illusion and or a subsequent delusion with the gardener. What did you guys think of my natural hypothesis up to that point, those first five facts?
I thought they were sound enough. I think I think that's fine. You've got to remember, I'm not an evidentialist, so um, you can certainly make a historical argument um, against Christianity. I do sometimes, but in the grand scheme of things, historical arguments fail for the negation of a miracle as much as they do for the proof of a miracle. So, for instance, Muslims are convinced that Muhammad split the moon. All right, there is no historical argument that I can make that would convince them that that did not happen. Christians are convinced that God split the Red Sea, not the Sea of Reeds, but anyway, that God split an ocean in two, and people walked across dry land. That's as outlandish almost as God splitting the moon. Christians believe literally that God hung a special star so that it hung over a house in a particular spot that people could go find. That is as absurd as God splitting the moon. I can give you all kinds of history. I can look at astronomy charts. I can look at tide charts and try to prove that that didn't happen. But you have to understand that when you're dealing with a matter of faith, which is a matter of religion, all religion, then the historical argument fails the same way as the theological argument does. So to the extent that you can give a historical argument, I think you did well. I think it's pointless, though, when it comes to faith.
And let me ask this. So, a couple things. So, would you say, first of all, just as a yes or no, that the proposal I gave is at least equally probable to positing the resurrection? At the very least, maybe it's more probable.
Yeah, I actually believe that any wild ass conjecture, a thing that you pulled out of your butt, a butt fact, any butt fact that someone comes up with on the spot is more likely than the resurrection. So the fact that you actually didn't do that makes it even stronger. But I'm just telling you from where, it's not just where I sit. I think it's where probably most historians sit, quite frankly. Any explanation that holds together as a rational explanation is going to be a better explanation than the creator of the universe bent time and space to do a thing.
Okay, yeah. So I disagree with that. So obviously I didn't use that as an excuse kind of thing. But okay, so I think you would say it's equal. And before I go to Tavo for his take on phase one and my natural theory on that front, I'm kind of curious. So I purposefully went into a level of specificity, which I know is very unpopular. People like James Fedor and all the skeptics, smart airmen, that it is popular to be as vague as possible because you want to keep all the doors, as many doors open as possible, right? You don't want to pin yourself down. But in this debate, for the purposes of this debate, I figured, look, my goal, I'm using the odds form of Bayes' theorem, where I'm comparing one hypothesis to another. So I can get as specific as I want just for fun. And so long as that is equally probable, given the evidence, I've won. Maybe it turns out I'm wrong or something like that. And okay, maybe it wasn't a grief-induced hallucination, but it was some other hallucination or something like that. Like I could be wrong on one of the specifics, but it ultimately doesn't matter. So long as I could show it's equally probable to the resurrection, then I won the debate. So I'm just kind of
I'm sorry. I got to butt in because that was going to kind of be my last statement. I can't let you get away with it.
okay.
I disagree with the premise. Your opening statement that if I can just prove or show that at least one thing is equal or probable, then I win. I disagree with that premise completely. In fact, the skeptic can be right about all the details. So all of the facts that you bring up can be correct. All your butt facts can be correct. There were hallucinations, and Paul is a liar, and Luke is inaccurate and definitely not a historian, or any set of things can be correct, and God could still have performed that miracle. So being correct about all of the mundane things still doesn't mean that something behind the scenes didn't happen. I know you believe that because that's how you believe about substance dualism. We can explain every interaction of the brain, and you would still say, but that doesn't mean that there can't be a soul. And you would be correct about that. And if God wanted to do things in a way that was kind of hidden and non-obvious, he would hide it behind a cloud of reasonable doubt. And so I think that you're incorrect by saying that if I could prove that, that a naturalistic explanation is equally probable, you could prove that it's 1,000 times more probable, and it still does not eliminate the idea that God did a miracle.
Okay, so Tavo, turning to you, what's your take on my natural theory covering phase one, the first five facts from the crucifixion up to the women thing, right? So there's the empty tomb through a necromancer or a reburial, but I would prefer the necromancer personally, kind of thing. And not only
It
that,
sounds
also
cooler, yeah.
and not only that, what is your take? Do you think I made a mistake by giving a level of specificity, which most skeptics are too afraid to? They want to keep things as open and vague as possible. Whereas I think for my strategy, it made sense. Hey, let's go for it. Let's get as specific as I think we can, so long as it's equally probable. So, yeah, what's your take?
Yeah, so I think as a strategy, it's very powerful, right? Because you say, let's look at the experience of Peter first. Is there a natural explanation for that? Yes. Is it likely? No. Right? But that's okay because you've dealt with that fact. Then you take the next fact. Is it likely or isn't it? Yeah, I mean, you could find, okay, so let's look at the fact that Peter appeared to the women, or Jesus appeared to the women. Like, is that, I think that's still in phase one, right? You had, I think, like 10 facts and 3 phases, right? Yeah. So um, I'm kind of, some of this is by memory recollection, so I may be misrecalling some of the aspects. But yeah, you could take each fact, look at it in isolation, and say, does this require a miracle, or could it have happened, on its own from some naturalistic mechanism? Well, I can come up with a naturalistic mechanism for each fact, each phase, right? And if you get really granular, then you're back in this sort of James Fodor-esque paradigm of saying, I can't, maybe I can't explain the whole picture, but I can take each detail and parse it out and develop a naturalistic explanation for it. Now, that to me gets back to what we started the debate with. If you have dozens of arguments, each one of which is unlikely, but each one of which, makes at least some stab at one of the details around the birth of Christianity, is that a persuasive set of arguments? I would argue no. It becomes infinitesimally improbable, and then you're left with 43 hypotheses rather than just one. There are several problems with that approach. One is it's clearly curve fitting, right? It's the problem with machine learning when the data is overfitted to a curve. I could take any curve and give you a bunch of lines that explain each time point in that curve, and yet if I keep those equations for each linear algebraic equation separate, I haven't really explained the curve, right? So I think it's mathematically fallacious to say each individual factoid can be parsed out, looked at on its own, disaggregated from the teachings of Jesus, who Jesus was as a teacher, who he was as a healer, the birth of Christianity, and look at those individually. I think, again, it's rhetorically persuasive, but again, it gets into like the when you get to these events that are really, really granular, then they become very, very easy to argue against, and I'll fully admit that. And but again, when you come away from the debate, do you really have an explanation for why the resurrection was proclaimed? I think the answer is no. Do you have an explanation for why that proclamation of the resurrection was compelling? I think, again, the answer is no. And you can take each factoid and parse it out, but I think all those factoids lining up and each one having an improbable explanation for it, and then you put them all together and you get this result, very, very exceedingly unlikely at that point.
Okay, just one clarifying thing, and then we can move on to phase two. Because Now, with what you said there, believe it or not, in the debate for phase one, at the very least, the numbers I assigned are actually true. With my skeptic or with my Christian hat on, I think the natural hypothesis I gave is, in fact, at the very least, equally probable. In fact, I think it is equally probable because I can't prove that's actually what happened on a balance of probabilities. But so speaking right now as Dale the Christian, I think I can explain the empty tomb naturally through the necromancer. That's equally probable. Obviously, the facts before that are just it's the same whether it's resurrection or not. He died on a cross. He was buried in a tomb by Joseph of Arimathea. But then the empty tomb, fact number three, a necromancer stole him. And that's taking into account the background knowledge about his predictions and Jesus' claims and all that. So there's a dependence there, right? And one thing is helping in a causal way to bring about my natural hypothesis. So after the women discover the
just a second, Dale. Just quick interruption. Your necromancer thing. I kept waiting for you to do this in the debate. Is a real thing, and I don't think that you sat on that hard enough because that's something that Christians aren't used to hearing, and so they wave it off as a butt fact. But it's not. There were, in fact, first of all, there was a belief in real necromancers back then. So you could say there were real necromancers, and necromancers true. We also know as a fact that grave robbery was rampant. And we do know that magicians and such stole bodies for the kinds of things that you're talking about. And so there is actually some historical scaffolding around that idea. And I don't think that point was made very well in the debate.
I mean, this is exactly the type of thinking that allowed Sauron to rise to power.
Okay.
I'm sorry,
I don't understand the reference. What kind of thinking?
Lord of the Rings. Everyone dismissed him as a necromancer. All right, okay.
Oh,
Lord of the Rings.
Okay,
all right, okay.
Yeah.
All right, sorry.
I'm not a lore guy. I've watched him. Yeah.
Okay. No.
Okay, go ahead, Dale. Sorry.
Yeah,
Sorry
I am interested in yours because you were hinting that, and again, and after that, they discovered the empty tomb. That led to a post-bereavement grief-induced individual hallucination for Peter. He goes back, reports that he believes that Jesus was risen, and then the women mistake the gardener or delude themselves, I guess is the best. It wasn't really an illusion technically, it's more a delusion. And Mary Magdalene says, hey, I must have saw Jesus too. He was in the form of a gardener. I didn't recognize him at first or something. And the women come on and say that. I honestly, even as a Christian, I think that is an equally probable natural explanation. So I wouldn't say we can argue for the resurrection on the basis of my first five facts. Are you disagreeing with that and saying, no, you think it requires a supernatural resurrection? Like my hypothesis is improbable relative to the resurrection for those five facts at least? Or
is directed to me or...
Yeah, I'm just curious.
Oh, yeah. I mean, here's my standpoint. I think the necromancer argument actually cuts in the opposite direction, right? Because I think the first argument, if Peter says, I saw Jesus, there's about a dozen Jewish sources, the Qumran scrolls, there's the earlier Hellenistic literature, the Book of Jubilees, the Book of Enoch. Jews were familiar with these works, and they all talk about ghosts and spectral appearances. And that would be the first thing that people would say. What you encountered was some sort of a spectral appearance, right? So people would have, shrugged him off at that point. So the real question becomes, why was it more compelling to people? These people were familiar with ghosts. They were familiar with necromancers. And you may argue that that's now surprising to Christians to hear about that. But I think if you're winning the debate on that, then you're winning on a gotcha moment. I think the first century, people knew what necromancers were. They knew what communion with the dead was. Now, there is a really important distinction around the resurrection of Jesus in that it happened after 3 days. There was this sense that there's this sort of impermanent death that lasts about 3 days. In ancient Jewish literature, this was the sense that if you're dead for 3 days, you sort of come back to life, and that would have counted as a resurrection. Okay, but after 3 days, the spirit should leave the body. And I think the bigger point is no one would have interpreted the experience of the disciples as miraculous if all that had happened with them, and Christianity would therefore have not been compelling and the narrative would have fallen apart, if people had just said, yeah, this is necromancy, this is a spectral apparition. And there was literature that talked about necromancy. There was literature that talked about spectral apparition. But the more you get into that literature, the more it actually cuts against the naturalistic hypothesis argument, because then people would have just thrown out the testimony altogether. And for some reason, they didn't. Right? There's plenty of other figures that they could have looked at, and they didn't throw those out. So then you're left with having to explain why the resurrection proclamation became uniquely compelling in that setting. Go on, Dale.
Okay, so that's an interesting thing. I guess with your, again, you keep looking at it from the end type thing, but I guess even with phase one, that could apply perhaps with the women. Like once Peter reports his hallucination, maybe he gets bamboozled somehow or something like that into thinking this is the resurrected Jesus. But I guess you would say, but it's improbable. The women wouldn't latch onto that and go, yeah, we saw him too. He must have risen. They would have been more skeptical in light and probably just, oh, you're seeing a ghost or something. Is that what I think you're saying? Where
within 5 years, Peter has to accumulate on his own about 500 followers, right? Because then Paul joins the movement. And this is like sort of a conservative application of Rodney Stark's sociological numbers for the early growth of Christianity.
But that's, I think, beyond phase one, right? Like
that is beyond phase one. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. And again, if you stop at the phases and you disaggregate the facts into their individual compartments and you argue against each of those facts, it's rhetorically persuasive because nobody can refute that. And I would admit that if that's the tact you have, then you're going to win the debate. But the real question is, when you get to the concatenation of arguments at the end, do you have a syllogism that plays out in what we observe historically in the scholarship and the academic literature around the birth of Christianity? And I would argue that, again, the whole becomes an emergent set of information that is different than the sum of its parts, right? So sometimes you put parts together and then the whole has emergent properties, right? So I don't know that you can just look at the parts individually. And,
sorry.
Yeah. Well, I'll stop.
I find that fascinating. Yeah. So like you do have this kind of top down. The whole is more than its parts. Whereas I came to faith more of a bottom up approach kind of thing. Like let's break these down into these individual appearances and what can we get and stuff. So I think that's a great way to point out there is a different way of looking at it. You do have to have, once you're done with the individual appearances, and this didn't come up in my debate with Juan. Just because there wasn't any time. But once you look at the individuals, you also have to give that cumulative forest level thing of assessing what's the plausibility or probability of the conjunction. This happened and this happened and this happened and stuff like that. And does that make a difference? In the case of phase one, I think it's equally probable, even breaking it down, but also even looking at the conjunction, because there is that dependence relationship. So, but when we include all three phases, is that the case?
Now let me make the other point of the argument, which is that each of these things is, I think, still at least improbable. For instance, Peter, I think we're still in phase one. Peter believes that Jesus resurrected, right? Now that is still in and of itself an improbable outcome of the experiences that we've described. It's not improbable enough that it requires a miracle, but I think even if you leave that in isolation, it's at least what we have is a set of explanations that are still not that great.
Gotcha. So yeah, you can question Peter. I'm not sure about that, but I can see what you're arguing and stuff. But I think combined with the empty tomb, it could push him over.
I think the best argument for Peter is a bereavement hallucination. That's the best argument that I've ever heard. That's what I gave it. And that has major weaknesses when we apply it to Peter, And I think getting even to two witnesses, you have a real problem with the entire Jewish corpus of literature, which all says you have to have multiple witnesses to attest. Even to change their calendar on a monthly basis, they needed multiple witness attestations. It takes more than just one person, So I think for a fantastical claim like we've talked about before on this channel, I think for a claim like I saw Jesus and he was physically there in front of me after everyone saw him die, I think you need to have some corroborating details from, I would argue, at least three different witnesses. And I think that's within the Jewish, Pharisaical Sanhedrin, very skeptical, critical based tradition.
Okay, fair enough. So, all right. So the last thing on my natural theory, I'm going to combine phase 2 and 3 together because we've already kind of completed James and Paul from phase 3. So, the appearance of the 12, phase 2, I explained this away, and I think Juan kind of picked up on a little bit that I perceive there's weakness here, but I appealed to the only thing that I think makes sense is some kind of mass hallucination. It's the James Fedor answer, followed by collective memory distortion and social harmonization and that sort of thing. The only thing I guess I'm sort of different is that I think we only have to argue that at least 6, the majority of the 11, not everybody had to experience it. It's not a simultaneous collective hallucination. Those are medically impossible. People don't share dreams or hallucinations. But due to some kind of coordinating mechanism, 6 or more of the 12 disciples were put into a state where it was conducive towards them having individual hallucinations. And through prior expectation, Peter talking and the women talking about the resurrection and them praying to see him or something like that, through some kind of prior expectation being cultivated and this coordinating mechanism, at least 6 or more would have been put into a state where they would have had individual hallucinations at different times, but it would be similar enough in content that they would interpret it to be the risen Jesus as an appearance. And then the next day, when they were remembering that, they sobered up or they were rested, their mind was back into a proper state. They engaged with the problems with collective memory that Dr. James Fedor talks about and this social harmonization. And it became this delusion that, oh, Jesus appeared to us last night at the same time in front of all of us. And he spent the night with us or whatever kind of thing. That was my explanation for the 12. And I appealed specifically to the example of Navy SEALs during Hell Week who have mass hallucinations of a boat. The appearance of the 500, I think we have no details or specificity on this. So it was just the Our Lady Fatima, something like that. So Tavo, what's your take on those two group appearances and my explanation there?
Yeah, the thing that I want to underscore is if you look at I had a debate with Dr. Fodor, really a brilliant chap. But, he presents the data in a much more convincing way than what it is based on a neutral reading of the cognitive psychology literature. So I think that's at least important as a context. Now, he admits that freely, right? And when we chatted afterwards, he's like, I realize that the data doesn't show exactly what I say that it shows. So he admitted that freely. He's summarizing it, he's presenting it for a YouTube audience, he's simplifying it, but I think when you gloss over some of that nuance, then you get into problems. I'll just give you one small example of what the literature purports to show versus what it actually shows. There's a good case where people were misremembering events that had actually happened, and I think this came up in your debate as well, the plane crash things. There was a really classic example where it was recently after the event, right? And they asked people in the cohort, they said, did you see this event happen? And they said yes, right? And they were asking it in a leading way to get people to answer yes. And then they asked a second set of questions, which is, can you be more specific? Did you actually see the plane crash or did you see the aftermath, right? And then the whole thing switched and they were actually admitting that they saw the aftermath. Now, a lot of people have written about this in the cognitive psychology literature. It's called a bias. In other words, we tend to present data that does two things. Number one, it always refutes the null hypothesis. And number two, it always casts human cognition in a more dubious light, right? So there's a lot of data that you can find in the literature. But if you actually read the papers, then that data becomes much more flawed. Now, I'll just give you one more example. Dr. Fodor cites a case report where, the headline of the case report is that this person saw his own mother after the mother had deceased. And it was presumably a bereavement hallucination that was very convincing, where he believed that his mother you could argue based on a very terse reading of the paper that he had actually seen his mother return from the dead, return back to the land of the living. But when you actually read the paper, it says specifically he had intact reasoning and he agreed that people don't return to Earth after they died, right? So, I mean, so that refutes the headline with which that data is often presented when that specific paper shows up in the scholarly literature. Now, I actually read that paper, and it's a really fascinating read, but it's a really poorly written manuscript. And the whole point of the manuscript is that paranormal experiences can happen, and that's probably how the mother was returning to life as a ghost. So the author clearly believes in ghosts, which I think is very flawed to put in the scientific literature anyway. But my point is this: you have to really get into the weeds on some of this data, and you have to read through some of the biases that exist. And the more you get into those things, the more you realize that there's no real parallel for the disciples' experience. And this actually came up in your debate. I think there was some sort of tacit admissions that, look, they're looking at the horizon line, and they're maybe seeing some structures in the distance, and they're like, oh, maybe that's a boat. And this is really sort of on the fringe of verisimilitude in their experiences and in the context of their experiences. But if you've ever been on a boat for a really long time, you kind of look at the horizon line, and your eyes sometimes like sort of plays tricks on you. But that's very different than like saying, like, I saw the boat, I saw the people on the boat. It was, this person who died and he came back. That's a very different set of circumstances, a very different constellation of things. And then you have the whole problem with a hallucination inducing a new belief, right? That doesn't happen. And then it actually has to induce a new false fixed belief. So it actually has to transmute from a hallucination into a delusion. And that's where the literature, again, becomes very problematic. That just doesn't happen unless you have some underlying organic psychosis. It just doesn't happen. We have thousands of cases, for instance, of post-bereavement hallucinations in literature. We have 0 cases of a post-death experience where somebody interprets that as a resurrection.
And just before I get David's take, well, did you mention what was your take about the appearance of the 500? And I kind of appealed to something like the Our Lady of Fatima, because again, when it comes to the 500, it's just something listed. We have 0 details as to what they saw, when they saw it. Like, what were your thoughts on the Fatima analogy, Tavo?
I'm sorry. I thought you said David. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, I mean, I think I always return to my original question: why was the resurrection proclaimed, and why was it compelling for people? Now, I thought you were granting very generously that 500 and granting its evidentiary weight. I don't personally think that the 500 is really critical evidence for me. We all know that numbers, when they were counting them in those days, were not, they were just rough estimates. So who knows? Maybe it was a few dozen people, or maybe it was, and we don't have any more details with that. And I kind of have to default to Dale Allison's very skeptical lens on that, which is, I don't really know what to do with that because it doesn't really show up anywhere else. I think when you have the disciples' experience, it actually shows up in multiple different traditions, although there are some details differentiating those traditions from each other. I think that's much more convincing. The 500 people who saw the resurrected Jesus, I kind of put that on a different shelf. I got into the miracle of Fatima for a while, just trying to research what actually happened. There was some kind of light that people saw, but different people saw different things. And if you're arguing that the experience was seeing a vaguely human, luminous figure, some sort of lights, I think that becomes pretty reasonable. I don't know what caused that or what it was, and we'll probably never know. I mean, and this gets into what David was talking about earlier, the splitting of the moon in the Quran. Muhammad didn't actually cause that to happen, right? The Quran is very specific that was something that people saw, and they interpreted it as an omen. It wasn't like Muhammad split the moon. That's something that gets carried forward through debates, but it's actually not a neutral reflection. Now, that could have been some sort of astronomical event, right? There's different sorts of like moon dogs separated by clouds that might have played some role, similar with when David was talking about the splitting of the Red Sea. That similar could be due to a geological factors, a wind set down effect, various tidal effects. So the question really becomes, how do these events, which have individually natural explanations, form together to create theology as an emergent outcome? Now, I think again, if you're John Dryzek in Discursive Democracy writes a lot about these ideas, that if you disaggregate any philosophy too much into its core ideas, you're left with something where the end product becomes impossible to reconstruct.
Awesome. All right. And David, you've been sitting there patiently. What's sort of your take on my explanation for the appearance to the 12? Obviously, and this is something in real life that I think is, yes, I don't think this works in real life as a Christian kind of thing. But there is this mass hallucination in the sense of these individual hallucinations. And there's some kind of coordinating mechanism, which it's kind of similar to Hell Week. Michael Kona mentions Hell Week with the Navy SEALs. Multiple people have these hallucinations, and they're similar enough in content that they delude themselves to think they're seeing the same boat or something like that. And the appearance of the 500, I appeal to the Fatima incident.
Well, I think you're right to appeal to Fatima. I'm trying not to give away too much of the conversation that we're going to have that will delve more into this. So I'm metering my answers a little bit here. I will return to a thing that I know makes Tavo very angry. I'm sorry, Tavo. Brace yourself.
I'm not. I'm
You're
enjoying
treating
the
the
conversation.
Bible like a history, like almost like a videotape history. Even good histories can't be taken with as much detail as I think Christians take these stories in the Bible. I listened to a debate on Unbelievable a few years ago. Dell, I imagine you probably heard it too. We were both on the boards at the same time. And it was a Christmas theme, and they were arguing. Someone came to argue the star over
Yeah.
Bethlehem, and the trying to come up with scientific, explanations of how this maybe could be possible in some way. And at some point, it became very painful to hear this kind of thing. It's a stupid detail and a stupid story. I don't even think it was written to be taken literally. What are you doing? It's like taking the Three Little Pigs and trying to explain how the wolf could blow a house down. I could do it. We could have some fun. I could give you some really intellectual commentary on how that is possible, but to do so is to miss the point of the literature that you are looking at in the first place. And I think a lot of this parsing is just that. So, man, how did all of those people have hallucinations? Well, first of all, you don't know. You don't have a single word written by these people. This makes a lot of Christians mad, but you'll have to talk to other Christians who probably have higher degrees than you that suggest that there's no way that either of the Peters were written by Peter, for instance. So we don't know what Peter's story was. Are we going to take it from Luke? We take it from Luke about Paul's origin story, but Paul doesn't give that story. In fact, he gives something different. So are we really going to take these kind of ideological accounts and treat them as if they were videotape and try to explain what we see on them? So I think that's a wrong-headed approach to these stories at all. Well, you've got to explain how they saw Jesus. You see, they touched him. It was multi-sensory. He ate fish. Dude, these are stories. These are details in a story. I don't have to prove any of it or explain any of it. But that said, if we want to explain it within the context of the story, and by the way, this is what I do, I talk about these stories within the context of the literature. We still don't need to go that far for explanation. So, for instance, we have at least a couple of people, maybe all of the people, who didn't believe they were seeing Jesus when they saw him. the woman who thought he was the gardener didn't believe it was Jesus. The people on the road to Emmaus didn't see Jesus. They knew enough about Jesus, so one might think that they were at least followers of him at some point. But here they're walking with him. They don't see him. Jesus comes into the disciples, the people who knew him best, besides the women, by the way. I already mentioned the woman who didn't recognize him, didn't believe it was Jesus. The disciples are what? Elated to see him? No, they're scared because they don't see him as Jesus. They don't see him as the guy that they were with. And so with every one of the accounts, no one, what we find out, believed on the basis of testimony. Zero of the people believed on the basis of hearing about an empty tomb.
No, wait a second. Wait a second. Can I interject and ask a question here, Dale? Do you actually believe that that's true? Do you believe that the strangers on the road to Emmaus didn't initially recognize Jesus, that Mary didn't initially recognize Jesus, that the disciples didn't initially recognize Jesus?
According to the story, they didn't. So
and
are you reading a different story?
And you believe that?
No, I don't believe that any of it happened. So let me say
you
it
think
again.
none of it happened? Well, if none of it
Excuse
happened,
me. Let me say it again. I comment on the. Excuse me. Excuse me. No. I can't let you finish that. I am going to repeat what I said up front. I comment on the stories within the context of the story, so I can talk about
that as evidence.
I can talk about yes, I can, because I'm within the context of the story. I can use Voldemort's motivations. I can use Harry Potter's visions. I can use all of those things to talk about the literature within the context of the story. So if I am just focusing on the context of the story, even inside of the context of the story, there are reasons to believe that they did not understand it as Jesus. They did not all at the same time come to the believe it was Jesus. At different times, it was like, wait, you're Jesus. Wait, okay, you're Jesus. And so when we take that together, we see a story where individuals over time came to believe that they saw Jesus.
Okay, well, I don't want to keep interrupting you, but
you keep doing it. So I think you do want to keep doing it. It's okay to want to interrupt.
The whole conversation, you've had your fair share of time to explain things. I don't feel like I've interrupted you too much, but I'll turn it back over to Dale. Then I'll let Dale, take.
Or you could have just let me finish what I was saying. But what was it that you wanted to say?
Well, like I said, let's turn it back over to Dale, and we'll let him.
Wait a minute. No, we're at this point. What did you want to say? Go ahead and say it.
Yeah. Go ahead, Dale.
Yeah. So let Tavo. Yeah, you say your point there, kind of thing. David, are you saying you didn't get to finish your original point you were trying to make? Or?
Well, let's just say it got broken up a little bit. So it may end up choppy, and the hearer may not hear it the way I was intending to say it. But that's okay. We're at this point. Tavo, what did you want to ask?
Well, I don't want to. Okay, so yeah,
it's okay. Tavo, what did you want to ask?
Let's turn it back over to Dale, and we can come back to this at the end. Go ahead, Dale.
Okay. So you successfully derailed my point, but you don't want to. You don't actually have anything to say. That's annoying, Tavo. So that we're here is fine. Interruptions happen. I've done a million of these podcasts. I've interrupted worse than you. But since we're here, there was something very important for you, and I don't want to move on until you say it.
It's entirely up to Tavo, though. Like I don't.
Right. Well, otherwise it just looks like a hit and run. But if you had something that was really important that we should address, I want to address it. And if you don't address it, it's just a hit and run, and that's bad faith.
Yeah, my point is this: you can't take the evidence and cherry pick the things that you don't like about the evidence, and then say these are the things that disprove the narrative, and say that you're arguing against the entire case. Right? If you're arguing against the entire case, that should be your stance. If you're arguing that some individual facets disprove the entire case, that should be your stance, right? But what you can't do is you can't say, we're going to accept these versions of the story and we're going to let go of these versions. In other words, if you're saying, I believe that these people initially didn't believe that they didn't encounter Jesus, that there was some initial misrecognition that happened, then you can't say, well, now, I disagree with what they're saying when they said, I later came to accept that this was Jesus. So you can't have it both ways. You can't allow a trustworthiness filter that only lets in evidence that supports your argumentation.
Okay, Tavo, I appreciate your point of view. I'm an atheist. Everybody knows that. Second of all, you don't get to tell me what I should believe or how I should argue. But I appreciate your perspective on that. I don't believe that Jesus existed, but I always argue as if he did, and I talk about the teachings ascribed to Jesus. Now, you might say, but if you don't believe that Jesus existed, you don't get to talk about the teachings. Well, you don't get to say that what I get to talk about and what I don't. So maybe consider that.
Okay, fair enough. All right, so I'm gonna move on now. So it got a little bit heated. I think you both kind of gave your points as to the way you see it. So yeah, at this point, I think it's fair to move on. Hopefully, both of you guys will agree with that. But
oh,
yeah.
no, you've seen heated. I can get heated.
Well,
that wasn't heated. That was me standing my ground.
Fair enough. Yeah, very, very. Yeah. Anyway, so I just want to move on because again, we've been having a great conversation. Both of you guys have been getting along together good for the most part. So
for sure, I'm really enjoying it for what it's worth. Yeah, I'm really having a nice time.
Same here. Yeah, I think you both are raising good points and stuff like that. So yeah, I guess I'll just say on my end, just for my take on those final two group appearances, I really do, in terms of the 500, I really do think that there's not enough data. So number one, I think that there is enough data to prove it's historical. That's why I included it. It's a very weak case, but it's more probable than not. That's why I chose to include it. It is something that has to be explained by a naturalistic hypothesis, just given the evidence kind of thing, right? So that's why I included it. In terms of the explanation, though, I think it's fully explainable. There's no details. I do think we can posit anything like Fatima happened, right? So I think Juan was kind of going back, well, they only saw a son. They didn't claim to have like a bodily appearance of Jesus or a bodily appearance of Mary in that case. But I think he was kind of missing my point there, is that it doesn't matter that all they're seeing is, if you ask them, what did you see? Oh, I saw a dancing sun. It was the sun was doing something weird in the sky. Yeah, but every single one of those persons agrees with the three little girls. They'll say, the dancing sun, that was Mary. She was doing that. She appeared to us that day, and all I saw was the sun. The girls saw Mary. They were lucky enough to see Mary, but they believed it was a Marian apparition to them in the form of a dancing sun or whatever. And that's what I'm saying. That's the same with Jesus. They claimed it was an appearance of Jesus, but again, there's no specificity. What was it they saw? For all we know, they saw a dancing sun, and they did this same thing that over those thousands of people did with the Marian apparition. There's no way to disprove or prove that that's improbable given the biblical data, because all we have is he appeared to 500 people. So I think that works. Now, in the appearance of the 12, that's where I think, no, that this thing requires a miracle. So my explanation is a failure, is what I truly believe as a Christian. And even as a resurrection skeptic, I kind of gave odds. They were overly generous for the resurrection, but it is true that I think the resurrection is much more probable than the natural option I gave. And somebody was asking me about Hell Week, and I gave the example of the Navy SEALs. So there are various objections. This comes from Dr. Mike Licona. And let me actually just, if you guys don't mind, do you want me to play a short little 2-minute video clip of Mike Licona interviewing a Navy SEAL about his experience on Hell Week? So hopefully you guys don't mind me playing that.
Oh,
no,
sure,
no,
go
that's
ahead.
great. Yeah.
Go ahead. But when we come back, I'd like the first crack at the 500.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully that's showing up here.
Mm-hmm.
So here's Mike in Tel Aviv interviewing. This guy was a Navy SEAL. and he's going to describe Hell Week.
Training, so you know who quit, when they quit, it's on display. These surf tortures you do over and over and over. I lost track of how many times we did them. If you're not in the water performing surf torture, you run over 200 miles during those 5.5 days.
Wow.
And that's not just running around with your own body weight. You're carrying a boat or a telephone log probably 90% of the time wherever you go. And that boat's so heavy on the top of your head, it literally rubs through the hair and through the skin in the top of your head. In fact, a guy in a class prior to mine broke his neck underneath one of these boats, so they're no joke. And then you can imagine what it'd be like to have that salt water and beach sand rubbing and grinding in all the unfriendly places on your skin for 5.5 days straight. You know, you just, every nerve you feel exposed of all this physical exertion. It leads to another thing, hallucinations. And you just see things that just flat out aren't there. And looking back, it's pretty funny. You know, when you're going through it, not so fun. So I hallucinated seeing Ninja Turtles in the water. I'm trying to whack them with paddles. Other guys are throwing hand salutes out into the water of people they think they see. But
okay, so that's just the short little video clip there. And the point I want to make here, in terms of a refutation, is look, these examples whereby there are collective hallucinations that occur almost simultaneously. They are of different things, and it's extremely rare that any of them hallucinate the same thing or similar enough things, right? One guy's doing Ninja Turtles, the other guy is saluting bicycle riders in the water and stuff. And what the data reveals is that they're usually totally unrelated. And that's why my hypothesis, I posited, well, you need some kind of coordinating mechanism and a similar expectation, right? And on that front, that's where you have the examples of a boat on the horizon. But there are problems with that because Tavo said, look, these boats on the horizon they could be actual objects and that sort of thing. And therefore they're illusions, not hallucinations in the first place. And secondly, when we apply this, you heard everything they had to go through during Hell Week. The disciples wouldn't have been in that much of a decrepit state and stuff. So here's the problem. So in order to have enough people, 6 or more of the 12, in a state which is conducive to them having individual hallucination within a relatively short period of time, and for them to be suggestible enough so that their hallucinations would be, because if they're so out of it, it's just going to be disconnected. And that's what the hallucinations literature, one guy's going to be hallucinating Ninja Turtles, the other guy, Jim Bob Jones doing jumping jacks or something like that. So you need some kind of socially coordinating mechanism. But for that, you have to be in a sufficient mental state that you can be receptive to suggestibility and have your expectations coordinated to where you think you're seeing the same thing. I see Jesus. Oh, you do? Yeah, me too. Yeah, there's Jesus there or something like that. So the problem is, number one, the problem is the tension. Like what is going to put 6 people to be in a state where they're mindful enough to be suggestible to other people and then influenced by what they claim to see so that they'll have their own hallucination, which is similar enough, but yet they are in such a state that they're going to be conducive to hallucinations like that as well. And it's very hard to get that balance. Even with my examples in the Navy SEALs, at most you get like 2 or 3 people. You never get like 6 people having hallucinations that are similar enough to convince them and stuff like that. There's also the problem of what happens afterwards, where they all go, the next day they wake up and they don't engage in the James Fedor collective memory, socialization, and that they realize, oh, it's all a bunch of BS. They're talked out of it, stuff like that. So that's a disanalogy there. And then finally, there is also the fact that their prior expectations and socialization would work against them harmonizing the details the next day. No, if they did have hallucinations, at least most of them would see Jesus in a glorious resurrection body. This is what their Jewish expectations would demand. And that would take over the group. Instead, either they all saw a mundane group or the majority of them saw mundane Jesus not glowing, still had the wounds in his hands, looks just like he does here on Earth and stuff like that. And that became the dominant way that they saw the risen Jesus through their hallucinations. That's unlikely to be a hallucination, and or unlikely to be the case that, oh, that's the details they worked out. No, it would have been the opposite. We would have had a glorious resurrection, things comparable to the transfiguration, for example. So those are the three main arguments that go against, even with an example of the SEAL team. It's not comparable to what happened with the disciples. It can't be used as an analogy there. So, yeah, that's all I wanted.
I would disagree with your analysis of what they would expect. And so I think I could argue, even within the confines of the story, that they would have, in fact, they got exactly what they would expect it, because what happened, they wanted to see the hands and the side. They wanted to see the wounds to prove it was him. Glorified body wouldn't have proven it was him. They already thought, it was someone else. So they needed to see the things that would convince them. And so that's what they saw. It's kind of like when we, from our seat in time, say no one would believe the women. Well, then maybe you don't understand Jewish burial, because it makes sense for the women to be the ones who would have been there and seen the body first, and or they would have been there, they would have seen it, they would have gone back to tell the disciples. That's exactly the expectation that you would have. But if you want to say nobody would believe the women, they didn't believe the women because they had to go check to see that the tomb was empty, and they still didn't really believe until they saw Jesus, and they still didn't really believe until they saw the wounds. And so you are, in fact, telling a story that tries to answer the expectations not only of them, but of the people who would be hearing the story, who would maybe ask these skeptical questions. And you have a story that very, very nicely supplies the details. But if you'll allow me an indulgence, let me just speak to the 500 for a moment, because I'm a little surprised, not that surprised, that you think that that's something historical. So again, I'm counting on what I get from the literature. And there are two disparate tracts of Jesus stories. There's the Pauline tract, and I could expand that a little bit more. And there are there's the gospel tract of these later communities. Paul came first. His writings came first. So they were there. And every one of the gospel writers, whoever they were, would have had some knowledge of Paul's writings or had time to know of Paul's writings. And so the reason this is important is because not one of the gospel writers believed Paul. So we can talk about reasons why that is. We could talk about the different communities, the Pauline community versus the Jewish Christian community. We would get a little bit deeper into that than we need to get here. But it becomes important because you have two very different, not close, two very different lines of how the appearances happened. The first person, if you read the Gospels, that saw Jesus was the women. A particular woman, in fact. She doesn't even make Paul's list. She's not there. Paul gives an ordered list. She's not only not first, she's not on the list. Paul talks about James, the brother of Jesus. He's not on the list in the Gospels. They're not coordinated at all. Paul has a few different ways of parsing out the 12 and Peter and so forth. And so these are very different ideas of how appearances happen. And Paul has this one that sticks out like a sore thumb, the 500. I'm not saying that Paul invented it, but he would have gotten it from a way different, a disparate tract of oral tradition than the writers of the Gospels. And so who do we believe? Do we believe the Pauline tract, or do we believe the Gospels tract, or do we do what Christians do and try to harmonize these together as if they were the same story, which they were not even close. They're not close enough to stitch them together to be harmonious. And so the biggest whopper in the two disparate tales is the 500. Because that's one that you would think that if they were going to agree on anything, they would agree on that, because that's a big number. That's a lot of people. And if Paul had just wanted to say, oh, well, there are a lot of people, he could have said many. You know what the gospel writers said, what Matthew said, when many dead people came from the grave and appeared to many, he said, oh, wait, let me see, many. He didn't say 500. He didn't say 5,000 or 4,000 did this or 3,000 were baptized. He said many. Paul said 500 people. He appeared to them at once. We know that these are different lists. We know that these are different tracts of ideation of the appearances. And someone's inventing something somewhere. And so if any one of those appearances is maybe not in the most doubt, it would be the 500. And the second one would be James. Because the ones narrating the story, the full narration, they're taking the bits and pieces and making full-blown stories out of them. We don't get James, and we don't get the 500.
Yeah, and we also don't get a narrative of the Apostle Peter in the Gospels, but we do get a mention in Luke that he did have one individually first, right? But why didn't Luke record the narrative details? So arguments from silence like this, number one, so even if what you say is true, I don't care. I go with the early, this is a 1 Corinthians 15's creed that goes back to the authoritative Jerusalem disciples. So
definitely earlier. No, we don't question, we don't differ on that.
Yeah. If what you're saying is true, but is it true? And I don't think it's even provably true. So number one, the women, why are the women excluded? Sexism. Right, that's easy to explain.
So Paul was a sexist?
Of course, yeah. I mean, he was, but it's not even him. He didn't make the creed. It was the earliest Jerusalem Peter and the 12. They were, for sexist reasons, they were saying, "Hey, this is going to look bad if we include the women in the creed. Let's just leave them out of it." And there were sexist motivations for that. So yeah, they thought that would make us look bad in the eyes of these in the eyes of the other Jews that were trying to convert and the other pagans.
Do you think that Paul knew about the women? Let's just give him your sexism thing. If Paul knew about the women but left it out because of sexism, then Paul is a bad actor. If he didn't know about it and he was giving what he thought was a clean list, then he's not acting out of the Holy Spirit. He's just wrong, and he got some bad data. And the gospel writers corrected him. Either way, it doesn't sound reliable.
But it is reliable. It doesn't deny that an appearance to the women happened. I don't know whether Paul, when he went to Jerusalem and he got this info, he spoke to a couple of male disciples, right? So, James and Peter. So, did they give him all the details about the women? I don't know, kind of thing. I believe that the 1 Corinthians creed is aware of an empty tomb. And if that's the case, they probably told him about the empty tomb. So yeah, I would speculate, let's just say that Paul's realizes, okay, it's better. First of all, I'm going to give the traditions as I receive them. It's not up to me to change them or add to them anyways. But even if I did, I think they're probably correct that it's going to look bad, especially I'm going after Greeks and Gentiles. They're way more sexist than Jewish people at the time. So, those women, you can't even go out of the house at certain times of the day, right? I'm fine with that, but I don't think there's that's tantamount to denying the women appearances.
Well,
Same.
if you give an ordered list, though, see what Paul. Look, we'll talk about this in a couple of weeks. When Paul gives his list, he gives it in terms of an ordered list. He appeared first to, and then next to, and then he gives an ordered list. I've heard people say, "Well, it's just a list." No, it's an ordered list. Um, and so, if that is the case, then it is a specific list. And you're saying that this list, whether through Paul or the Holy Spirit or whatever, just gave a incorrect list. If you believe the women were first, you have to acknowledge that this is an incorrect list. Something is wrong. One of the camps got it wrong. It is a clear contradiction, though, and that's why I can look at the 500 and say, not just because no one else heard of it, but because we know there's tampering with the list.
I would just say it's an incomplete list, is how I would say it. It's not an incorrect list kind of thing. But yeah, getting to the 500, the appearance of the 500, I forget. Yeah, so it's not in the Gospels. Well, again, number one, some people say, some scholars think that it is. This is the Matthew appearance on the mountaintop in Galilee. And certainly, again, it's 500 brethren, so there could have been more people there, including like women as well, right? That aren't counted there, and children and stuff. So some people say it's Matthew 28. This is the appearance mentioned on the mountaintop. Other scholars, I think this is less likely. They'll conflate it with the ascension and stuff of Jesus. So it could be that it is in the Gospels, actually. It just doesn't mention 500 people specifically, kind of thing. And it doesn't need to.
I think that harmonization is harder to pull off academically and intellectually than it is to just say these are different lists and they had different reasons for coming up with the lists, and different communities had different ways of telling the story. I think that's the better way to do it. The harmony is very clunky, but look, I don't. Look, like I said, we'll talk. It's fine. You have the last word on that. I didn't mean to harp on it this long.
We do have some audience questions that I've been saving, but let me just ask both of the guests. But before we go, because I have been kind of guiding this conversation to make sure we covered Juan's opening material and my opening material. But just kind of curious, the both of you, like Tavo, I'll start with you since I was talking to David last. Is there anything that about our debate that we haven't talked about, or that you think is an important point for the audience to know about how my switcheroo debate went?
No, I mean, I thought it was an interesting conversation. I'd love to do a switcheroo at some point. I'll probably try to do one with my channel, with some of the atheist channels that we're in good contact with. There's a lot of other good people who are atheists who comment on a lot of my videos who are eager to be on my channel. So we'll probably do something similar. But I thought it was very good. I thought it wasn't. I don't think there was any lapse. I think there was a degree of gamesmanship in that debate specifically, but I think it was. I don't think there was anything manipulative going on. And I think as long as you have those good intentions when you go into a conversation like that, I think you're likely to come out to areas of consensus and the truth that you hadn't appreciated beforehand.
Cool. David, is there any points or something that we didn't cover that you think is important for the audience to know with respect to the debate between me and Juan?
Well, yeah, I mean, it would just be your dangerous grant of practically everything. If it was a real skeptic, I don't just mean me. I just mean if it was a real skeptic, they would never grant that much. And so the thing that I keep saying here is one of the things they would never grant is that the source material you're using, a very kind of mythical, allegorical part of a religious document, and reading it to get your facts from and then parse those facts is something that a skeptic would simply not do most of the time. And so, whereas I think that you did good at staying as true to your core beliefs as you could, and so you grant all those arguments because you believe them. I think that a lot of people, including me, in a situation like that, as much as I like to grant things for fun, I wouldn't have granted nearly that much. And so a lot that could have, maybe should have been questioned as a skeptic was never addressed.
And just out of curiosity, are you talking about the facts or are you talking about the sources I allowed?
Look, I think some of the facts that are only evidenced by story material. Just here's an example. I don't remember how this came up or if it at all came up in this debate because I've been watching a lot of stuff lately. But the dead coming to life in Matthew 27. You you can debate as a skeptic whether Jesus rose, but you would never accept the description that many dead people rose from the grave and appeared to many in Jerusalem. I think no skeptic would ever grant that, right? But in this debate, that kind of thing was just granted, and so it never got discussed. And so the dangerous thing with granting too much, take it from me, someone who grants too much all the time, the dangerous thing is that some of the things that probably should get discussed and explored and challenged don't get explored and challenged because you've just waved it away.
Interesting. Yeah, it's interesting. I'll reflect upon it. My initial reaction is I'm not. I think, and then you're not alone here, David. But I think the skeptics are not understanding the nuance of my case. I'm not. I never granted nearly as much as they think I am. It's true. I granted things like the appearance of the 500 because that's what the evidence. Whether I'm an atheist or Christian in real life, that's what I think the evidence warrants on a balance of probabilities. And in fact, I kept one fact out. I think we could prove on a balance of probabilities very weak. It's within the agnostic range that there was a second appearance to the 12 disciples. I think based on the Jerusalem Galilee things that it's more probable than not that that's thing. But I oscillate in the agnostic range from more probable to improbable. Mm-hmm. And because of my oscillation, I said, well, I'm not going to include that. But in terms of me accepting secondary details, I was totally against that. It was Juan who was trying to bring that in. And his opening, he used things like touching and eating. And I'm like, I'm not going to grant you that. I'm not going to grant you that Paul was blind. All we have is an unspecified appearance here. Or
yeah, you definitely gave pushback on some of those details, which I appreciated. I guess I'm saying I think there could have been more pushback on more of the details, and it would have made the debate longer. And you granted them for probably the same reasons that I would grant them, because I don't think they're that important. And I want to get to the real meat that is important. And that's why I grant a lot of things. By the way, that's why I think a lot of academics grant a lot of things, why they don't bother questioning some things, because it doesn't matter. That those details don't matter. They still don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead. So they can grant all kinds of things that they don't have to spend half a lifetime searching out and still come to the conclusion that they don't think that Jesus rose from the dead.
All right. So now we come to the fun part. And my apologies to the audience. I know I usually raise questions throughout, but I thought it was important to be respectful to Juan and myself to make sure we covered our opening cases with the two guests kind of thing. So I think we explored that fully. But now we'll come to the fans. So first question is for you, Tavo, and David, you can give your response to each question. But starting with you, Tavo, from James, he says, embarrassing details are a tradition in the Tanakh. Is that an evidence or a style?
I think James is no longer in the chat, but that's a good question. I don't know that I know that much about the Tanakh to be able to discuss this as a scholar. In other words, I need to look at what embarrassing details are being referred to here and what they are. I think there's a degree to which human humility is invoked a lot in Jewish scripture that's probably influencing some of the Christian scripture. I don't look at embarrassing details as an independent criteria. I recently put out a video where I talked about 11 different evaluative criteria for the trustworthiness of individual statements of Jesus. One of the things that I mitigated is embarrassment criteria. I think it's interesting. It's worth looking at. I think there's at least some details that would be omitted by the relevant figures. But yeah, I'm willing to stipulate that there is Jewish literature that goes in pretty hard on embarrassment. That's why I don't emphasize it super heavily as a style, but I'd be curious to know what information you talk about in the Tanakh. Good question. It's a reasonable counter argument to the argument from embarrassment.
Cool. Yeah. David, did you have anything you wanted to contribute to this question?
I would just amen that. Look, for many, many years, I've said that the worst part of historians' criteria for history is the criterion of embarrassment. It's an embarrassing criteria, and it's been debunked by actual historians. So it just seemed to me, as a layman, that was embarrassing. And reading the Bible and knowing the Bible as well as I do, and listening to historians talk about the Bible, it just makes me wonder where they got their degree. Like I just mentioned, the women. It would have been a more embarrassing detail if the women weren't the first to see it, because it wouldn't have made sense of the story. They're telling a story in a setting where the women behaved exactly the way they were supposed to behave. They were supposed to be the ones to take care of the body. So I don't know how you get someone else in there to do it. If it would have been the men who discovered it, so the people would have said, "What were they doing there?" That would. So to say that a woman is the discovery is an embarrassing thing, that assertion is itself an embarrassing thing. Peter is oftentimes a buffoon, but he's being set up to be the leader of the show. That's normal. Every hero's journey has something like that. Maybe the writers leaned in heavily on that, but it's kind of like that conversion experience, which I would argue is a part of that genre of writing. Part of that conversion is Peter's a buffoon, and now he's brilliant. Thomas didn't believe, and now he believes. It's that journey that says some transformation must have happened, and it's setting up the resurrection as the transformation that must have happened. So you have to have those kinds of details in the story, or else the story wouldn't hit the way it does.
All right. Yeah, it looks like I might have dropped some. I had some specifically aimed at David and stuff, but here's one from Juan at Modern Atheism. He's saying 25% of Muslims who convert to Christianity report dreams and visions as one of the main causes for this. So it's not true that hallucinations are always congruent with your theology. And that is something I realized, yeah, I gave the unique thing for James, the brother of Jesus. I said that his resurrection appearance was a dream. I think that's kind of unique. Nobody has said that. But yeah, so what... David, we'll start with you on this one. What's your take on dreams and visions? And
I would say, first of all, we don't know anything about the conversion of James, and so all of that's speculation. I know that dreams and visions was a thing that lots of people who are religious and or mystical or magical went into. That was just a part of the environment, much like in Baton Rouge. We're big on dreams and visions and have been as a people for a long time. That doesn't mean that this is a good way to test the truthfulness of a thing. Heck, I've had some very interesting dreams and visions. Will not be glad to talk about them, so you can only speculate, I guess. But the dreams and visions will tell you more about my psyche than they will tell you about actual things that happen in reality. And so I would say that the very fact that this is one of the ways that they thought to prove supernatural claims by dreams and visions is another reason to disbelieve their supernatural claims.
All right, Tavo.
I think that's a leap. I think saying that this is a reason to disbelieve a specific supernatural claim is probably not true. Now, you could argue that there's a reason there to be skeptical, to be more skeptical. However, I would argue that we would all start off from a skeptical lens. So the question is why these experiences become compelling. I would argue if you're somebody who's not inclined to believe and you have a single dream, you're probably not going to change your perspective. I would also point out that there's all the literature that we have around hallucinations suggests that hallucinations come out as congruent with your pre-existing theology. Okay. Now, if I don't know enough about these anecdotal cases, but I know oftentimes the problem is these people have real world experiences subsequently that confirm their earlier inclination or their earlier proclivity. So if you're just saying, do hallucinations produce a change in theological outlook? The answer is, from the medical literature, from the scholarly literature around hallucinations, the answer is no. They don't change anything.
Except Christians convert, though, right? They convert to other religions too. That never gets talked about. But I don't disagree with what you're saying. I just would like you to also add in your assessment the hordes of Christians that go convert to other religions. Some of them strap bombs on and blow up school buses.
And for fairness, I will just point out you did interrupt Tavo there. So
I just interrupted Tavo, and so I hope I didn't derail you.
Sorry,
but I just wanted you to incorporate that into what you're saying, so I hope that you do.
I think what we can conclude is a larger demographic point. I don't know of any Christians, any people who are Christian who then became Muslim, who then blew up a building. I don't know of any. I maybe there was some experience with a guy who was atheist who became a member of the Taliban. I don't remember that. I would argue, though, that's probably the exception to the rule. I think if you look at demographics, how do people become Muslims, right? By and large, and this is coming from somebody who's a Mazir, so I'm not being disrespectful when I say this, but by and large, the Muslim world is increasing quite rapidly, arguably the fastest growing religion, but it happens by and large through fecundity, right? Now that's a very different mechanism than people converting to Christianity, which happened because of dreams, maybe because of visions, but because also of resources that exist in their communities. I can tell you anecdotally, the Christians I know who converted from Islam, it wasn't because of a dream. It was because they had a dream that said, you're going to meet this person tomorrow and they're going to talk to you about Jesus, and then you should be open-minded about it. And then they meet the person the next day and they have the experience that corroborates that. So I would argue if you just have a hallucination, you're still exceedingly unlikely to change your outlook. Moreover, again, we come back to my larger point. Why was the resurrection proclaimed? And why did it become compelling? If it was just because Peter had a hallucination or just because a couple of people had a hallucination, I would argue that the religion never would have taken root as a proto-community, right? So, I think Juan's question is good. Maybe what we need to do is dig into the data, get more granular with it. But I would argue that no one converts based on a single dream alone. Good question, though. But for Muslim conversion, the argument is almost always fecundity, right? And for Christian conversion, it's other mechanisms. Just interestingly, as an interesting demographic aside.
All right. So this is an interesting one. So Skeptic Philosophy asks me a question, actually. So he's saying, why am I talking about 6 or more of the 11 disciples having this appearance? None of the sources claim this, and later documents claim they all saw this. So this is true. All of the data says that it was all of the 11 disciples who had this group experience and that sort of thing. I just say, as a skeptic, when I'm being skeptical, I'm saying I think I can establish as a worst case scenario that at least 6 or more. This isn't based on biblical data, but it's based on psychological data, right? So I'm trying to be open to the fact that maybe the later documents are wrong, and it's possible that some of them didn't have a resurrection appearance of Jesus. If that was the case, then why did they claim to see the risen Jesus? Why didn't they recant, and why were they making this claim? Well, I think that given certain psychological knowledge that we have, modern psychological knowledge, if the majority of the group, which would have been 6 out of 11, claimed to had an appearance experience that they believe was genuinely the risen Jesus, the majority of the group could peer pressure the others and cause them to delude themselves into saying, yeah, I really believe he was risen. And even believing that he appeared to them when they themselves didn't see it. Remember that Fatima kind of thing? They'll say, well, yeah, he appeared kind of thing. I don't know why I didn't see him, but he was obviously in the room. Look, everybody's saying it and stuff like that. So like, I'm just saying that as sort of like a worst case scenario that based on, modern psychological knowledge. But yeah, clearly the Bible, if you want to give me all 11, cool, I'll take that. That's even better. That's even more improbable and more proof of a supernatural resurrection. So yeah, does anyone want to respond to this? Or
Yeah, I think that you should, the questioner should look into Pelosia's minimal witness argument, because what Dale is saying is kind of a nod leaning in that direction a little bit. It's kind of a question of how few people could you get away with and still account for the story. And so I think that I think that Dale is right to that way of looking at it, that at least 6. I mean, we could say, for instance, we don't know how any of them died. We've got some maybe thoughts about James, Peter. We don't really know about Paul. By and large, we don't know how they died. Ask Christian scholars. We simply don't know. There's a lot of oral tradition, legend, that sort of thing. We don't know that they died proclaiming Jesus. We don't know not only how they died, we don't know what they did. They're barely mentioned all at once as a group by name. And so the story focuses on 2 or 3 of them, and the rest of them just kind of drop off. And so they feel like filler material to get up to 12. But I would agree with Dale, you don't need all 12 of them in order to anchor the accounts. And so I actually do agree with your approach there to say, well, if you had, we maybe could point to half of them, and that would be enough.
And just to differentiate myself from Apologia is, so he was kind of saying, well, what 1 is sufficient. If only Peter saw it, that I would disagree with that. I think if you had 5 or less, a minority of the 11 apostles that had a hallucination or a resurrection appearance, I think that the majority would talk the minority out of believing in the resurrection. And
the reason that wouldn't matter, though, is because of what I said. We don't have any record of the majority. We only have a record of the minority. And so you could say, well, what if those minority that we have, a lot of stories about, what if they were the only ones that believed? They could have been the only ones that believed. We would have still gotten stories about the 12. Because we don't have any of their accounts. We don't know what they did, for whatever reason. If the Bible authors knew what they did, they didn't talk about it for whatever reason. And so that's why I would say that you don't even need to convince all 12. 7 of them could have walked away and said, this is bunk, and you'd have still gotten the Gospels, because you only get the stories. You only get the stories about 2 or 3. So we don't even need those other clowns.
Yeah, but that's my argument. That's wrong. If you only convinced, if 3 people had an appearance, no Gospels, no Christianity, no resurrection to begin with, the whole thing would have fallen. Peter would have went home and became a fisherman. He would have been talked out of it. So that,
but I'm telling you, in essence, we do get that story with only 3 of them. That's what we get. We don't get a story of the acts of the 12 apostles. So it would be a different story if we did. It would be, I think, a better story and more convincing. But what we get in reality, even of people making up stories that I think are, mostly fiction, we only get about 3 of them. So
not true. We get 6 or more, kind of thing. But based on psychological ground, reasoning and logical reasoning, kind of thing. That's my argument. So that's where we would differ, right? You would think 3's enough. I disagree. Apologia thinks 1's enough. I disagree.
Right. I don't think they were 12, Dale. So I don't.
Tavo has an answer.
That's a different. Yeah, that's a different story. But that's, I think that most skeptics anyway, maybe some Christians, will understand what I am saying, even if there wasn't 12. we have enough stories in the Bible so that it's good. And so if you say, well, we've got pretty good stories about 6 of them, great, that was enough. However many stories we have, that was enough. You didn't need any more than that.
Okay. Tavo, do you have anything on this or?
Yeah, I would press back on a lot of things that were said. Some of it's just plainly factually incorrect. Some of it's just sort of problematic. I think we can't look at these stories through an anachronistic lens, right? A modern historian writing these stories would have talked about the 12 disciples and would have delineated what happened with each person by name. Why do we not see that in the Gospels? Well, because we know that writing was in its early forms in that time. Literacy wasn't huge. People were writing very terse summaries of things that happened. So the question isn't, can we name each person and name their actual outcomes, right? We know from the Vindolanden tablets, and we know from the CIL. These are huge bodies of inscription, bodies of literature, that we know that writing became advanced. It became more detailed. It went from being very vague to being very detailed in the first century. That's exactly the tendency that we see with the Gospels. So I don't know that that should surprise us. The fact that somebody didn't write down, well, this is what happened with Andrew, this is what happened with Nathan, this is what happened with Big James. I feel like that's an anachronistic standard that we're applying to this stuff. Now, there's 2 more important data points that we haven't talked about. Number 1, we know from Talmud 43a that there were additional people who were killed alongside of Jesus. Now, this is a later tradition, admittedly, so it's somewhat flawed, but we have enough data points that we can interpolate that there were probably other consequences. An additional data point that we have is Josephus, who says that when they killed James, when Ananus II killed James, and Ananus II was the high priest at the time, and he himself lost his high priest status because he went against the Roman Empire to kill James and James' followers as well. Now, that means that there was a huge motivation on the part of the Jews to kill not only James, but James's followers. How many of the disciples were in that cadre of followers, that cohort that was killed by Ananus II? We don't know, but we know it wasn't just James. We know it was additional people. What about the Talmud 43a? Do we know that the names of the people? No, those are probably confabulations. Those are probably theological embellishments. They're probably lost to time. But we know the core of the Talmud teachings, the core of the oral traditions, were well preserved. So it's very reasonable to speculate that there were additional punishments by Jesus, additional punishments by the Jews towards Jesus and Jesus' followers as well. So not just Jesus. We also know that people were imprisoned in Judea for proclaiming their belief in Jesus, right? So we know that there were imprisonments that happened. That's something we know from the historical record. So you can look not only at death as a potential consequence, you can look at also people who were jailed. We know that the stonings were not officially sanctioned by Rome, so it's entirely plausible there were other early followers who were killed in acts of mob violence. But I think we can't sort of look at this through an anachronistic lens. Is my first point. My second point is, if we do look at the other literature, the Talmud, Josephus, we see actually other important data points that we do need to incorporate when we answer these questions. Now, the biggest teaching point here is, if you look at Paulogia, there were 2 witnesses, right? Peter was the first witness and Paul was the second witness. That means that Peter by himself had to hold the whole religion together to get 500 people, so that when Paul joined, or at least a few hundred people, even by a very conservative estimate, so that when Paul joined, there would be enough of a nucleus of community so that Paul would be able to make a difference. Now, I think that's very flawed. If Peter doesn't have some help, if some people don't agree with Peter, I think you're really looking at an uphill battle, which was already an uphill battle from several lenses. And I think also we have to take into account the Jewish context. Jews were very skeptical of individual witness tradition. So if you're saying that people were just going based on what Peter's experience was. So in other words, I don't know that I believe 6. I believe that you have to probably have a good chunk of the disciples who are still around. I believe probably Jesus wasn't the only one who was killed initially. And I believed in the subsequent few years, there were probably other people who were executed. Definitely at least some followers who were along with James. Some of those might have included other apostles, other disciples, other people in high rankings in the church.
So, Tavo, would you tell me, based on your studies, what do you make of the fact that Paul talks about the 12 when there were not 12 at the time that Paul would have talked about them? So the way I read that is it's more of an embellishment, almost a title for theological reasons. There never had to be a 12 for them to get that name. but Paul is still using a 12, and we know that Judas wasn't there. And the other person hadn't been chosen yet. So, um, do you see any problem with that, and any room for saying that maybe there weren't 12 to begin with?
No, I don't see any problem with that. I mean, I think, like you said, the 12 was a title, just like 7 is a title. When Jesus says you have to forgive, your brother not only 7 times, but 70 times, 7 times, he's not being literal there. He's not saying literally you have to count out to 490 times and then you can stop. Right. And I think, like, similarly, when Paul talks about the 12, there's nobody doing actual head counts. The 12 was sort of a title of disciples. Maybe there were 12. I actually don't know the timeline well enough to know whether or not Judas had been replaced by that point, right? That's the person you're referring to, that when Judas died, it was down to 11, or when Judas.
Right, Jesus had already ascended. I think that was after the ascension. But yeah, so there would have been 11 at the time.
But maybe they picked from one of the other people who was around who saw Jesus's ascension. I don't know. That's maybe a mechanism where they could have gotten back to 12, and why Paul would still be referring to 12.
Okay, but is that what you think, or is that more of a workaround?
I don't really know the answer. I think it's a detail that's probably a nut or bolt that I don't need to get too heavily into. But I'll just, for purposes of this discussion, agree that when Paul says 12, he doesn't necessarily mean I counted out to 12 and they were all there. Like, he may just mean that core of disciples. Whether or not there was a 12th member of that core that replaced Judas, and it was actually 11, he was rounding it up to 12.
Right. I think I would agree with that core of disciples. The only difference between you and I in this case would be how many made up the core. And I think that 12 was a very important number, but I don't think it was necessarily a specific number of a core. Dale, go ahead. I just wanted to get Tavo's clarification on that.
All right, so we have one last question that I'll ask, and then just a comment for David. But so another YouTube channel says, so if God truly is in the realm of the unknown, this came up during our talk on the prior probability, to some extent, then why wouldn't God be the exception? So yeah, do you guys want to...
the exception to what? I don't understand the question.
I guess it's like...
I can clarify the question if that's helpful.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead, Tavo, if you know what he's asking.
So this is a really insightful individual who sent me a really long email yesterday about my CTF argument, and they've commented a lot on my channel. So I think I'm doing a little bit of mind reading here, but I think you're right. I think they're saying, why wouldn't God be the exception? So the argument here is God doesn't seem to be knowable based on the scriptural version of God, right? There are gaps in what we can know about God. We can't really see God. We can't really know God. So I think what they're saying, I think this is more of a question for David. If God comes from the realm of the unknown, then shouldn't it be expected that we can't know God fully?
Yeah. So, yeah, sure. I think it's more expected that we would not understand him, or that even if he tried to speak to us, we would misunderstand him more than we would understand him. So that makes perfect sense to me. I mean, lots of gods and stories, you can understand them perfectly. They're just jerks. God seems to be just a jerk, but maybe there's more to that story. But what if you just stay within the context of the story? We see a lot of people who think they understand God but don't. So yeah, if I understand the question, it makes sense that this God would not be very well understood by a lot of people. I mean, they didn't understand Jesus. His own disciples didn't understand Jesus when he was walking with them and talking with them and teaching them every day. All the way to the end, they still didn't understand him. And so it was probably not until after he had ascended again that they started to understand him.
All right. So last but not least, this is just a comment. He did have a question, so I guess I'll ask that for you, David. But first of all, so he says, David, this is James, by the way. I need to go, but I'm going to check out your channel and subscribe. Just like Tavo, Dale, Juan, and anyone else, I'm looking for a breakfast club. if you remember the movie.
Yeah.
So you
Well,
gained,
good luck, my friend.
so you gained a subscriber there, but he did have a
I
question.
might be up to 9 now. Can we just call him the 12?
It is the circle. But yeah, he was saying back about when you're talking about Paul's motivations. I can't find his comment where it is, but essentially he was saying, David, you dummy, don't you know that the internal evidence, if you knew Hebrew and rabbinical traditions, Paul is extremely reliable in the information he's giving. I wish. Oh, here it is. Actually, found it. Okay, so David, no, you can know Paul's training if you know the Hebrew language and rabbinic discussion, the difference between Shammai and Hillel. So
No,
That's a
you
really
can't.
insightful point. That's an
Yeah,
interesting point.
it's an interesting point, but no, you can't. So, great. Paul was obviously a well-educated person. How he got educated, what the nature of his education was, we don't know. You can't say that because he wrote like this that he was a student of Gamaliel. Maybe he knew of Gamaliel. Um, Maybe he wanted to be a student of Gamaliel, and Gamaliel said, "Get the heck out of here, kid. You're not a good thinker." We don't know, and you can't tell just by his writing style or the level of education he seems to have, or his knowledge of Jewish tradition, which I would argue is pretty weak because he says a lot of things about Jewish tradition that just seems to be wrong. If you read the Old Testament and then read Paul next, um, so. Great, nice try. Sounds very academic, but I don't believe that you can, in fact, validate Paul's claims
what's this?
just because of his writing style.
So I see David gained a subscriber and he's just lost a subscriber now. From
Dang
Jake.
it.
So
Dang it.
Tavo,
Back down to 9.
all right.
12. It's 12. Dang it.
All right. So yeah, Tabo, anything you wanted to contribute on this front with Paul and the internal evidence for his reliability?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to be epistemically humble in some of these situations. When you say we can't know if Paul came from the school of Hillel or the school of Shammai, I think I think you have to sort of delineate. Are you saying I don't know, or are you saying there's no way to know the difference?
I am making the stronger statement that we can't know. Um, that said, I could be wrong, but if I wanted to make it seem like I came from a particular, let's say, seminary tradition, I know enough about seminary traditions to make it seem like I did, or to make it seem like I came from any at all. Um, so I just don't think that history has provided us with enough information to make that call. I think the real call that people are making is whether they trust Paul to be a reliable source of information or they don't. And I don't think that there is about the supernatural. You can check his work on some mundane claims, but that's not the stuff that faith is made of. And so at the end of the day, it really comes down to whether you trust him or not.
All right, cool. So we are at the 3.5 hour mark. So I am going to close out. It's getting close to my dinner time, so I'm going to have to go. There is one last piece of feedback from Teddy Pappas.
Oh, great, yeah.
Yes.
She said that you did a major letdown representing the resurrection case because you didn't bring up the Shroud of Turin. And that's the strongest argument for the resurrection. So
knowing Teddy, that is exactly what I would expect her to say. So I think that we have absolute documentary evidence that is Teddy Pappas.
Awesome. So yeah, awesome guys. Thank you guys for joining me. And yeah, I appreciate that you guys checked out the Devil's Advocate debate between me and Juan and gave you guys feedback. And yeah, looking forward to doing subsequent shows with you guys in the future.
David, I'd love to have you on the channel anytime. You're welcome. Dale, we have some stuff coming up. We're looking forward to that as well.
Yeah, Tavo, what I recommend is, you've got a lot of things that you want to talk about. And, if you want to isolate one or two of them and let's dive deep into them, I'm happy to do it. I didn't come to this show prepared to talk general discussion on the resurrection or even my own personal theories about the resurrection. I came to just most prepared to talk about the show and the points that were brought up there. But that doesn't mean that I'm not interested in talking about the things that that you wanted to talk about. It just wasn't today.
Can I just say one last really quick thing, Dale?
Sure.
I think the point that I've tried to make in this debate is something that emerges from Dale's debate with Juan. It's not trying to play gotcha or bring up like an abstruse point. It's to try to say, look, we know that there was a resurrection proclamation. We know that it was convincing to a lot of people. Do we have an explanation for that? And I've made the argument, which I think is something that comes out of the debate that I watched, which is that we can maybe come up with a few dozen different explanations, each one of which is unsatisfying, or we can have one thing that at least explains everything that we observe in the historical record. And I think even if you look very charitably on everything that's been said from the skeptical lens in this debate and in Juan and Dale's debate, you're still sort of left with that conclusion that you can have one explanation that can fit all of the observations that come out of it, or you can have a few dozen explanations. And I feel like we're still sort of at that point where, if you think about it, we've been talking here for 3 hours, and maybe there's been some points against biblical inerrancy. There's been some points of doubt against Paul. There's points of doubt against Luke. But even if I'm very charitable to all those points, and I think some of them are really contrary to the scholarly record, but even if I'm very charitable to all that stuff, even the stuff that I deemed factually inaccurate, I think you're still left with, well, I don't really have an explanation yet other than the resurrection.
Sure, but I mean, I don't know why you need one singular point to, instead of a lot of points. Why don't we have a unifying theory of quantum gravity and, everything? Well, maybe there is no theory of everything. Maybe we don't actually need a unifying theory, as some physicists believe that we do. And maybe here you're looking for the one magic bullet that pulls it all together. And I'm not sure that there's a case that there has to be one thing.
All right. I just strained my neck. Ouch. But
Oh no! Oh, sorry, Dale.
yeah, right at the end.
And even behind your sunglasses, I could see that you were rolling your eyes to the back of your head,
no.
wondering when are they going to stop?
Yeah, we'll stop now. Sorry, this has been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
but yeah, and Tavo, yes, I would like to talk about those things. I actually think that there's a point even beyond that. Maybe we can talk about some of that. But
I would
yeah,
love that.
definitely. Yeah.
And yeah, all right, awesome. And yeah, just so the audience knows, the next, obviously on the 17th, I'm going to be with David J on his resurrection thing. But before that, so on Easter Monday, tomorrow, Easter Sunday, posting up my show with Phil Baer and biblical scholar Dr. Craig Blomberg on the resurrection. And then on Easter Monday, I'm going to be on the famous Iron Sharpens Iron radio program, talking about the Shroud of Turin. So that'll be live at 3 p.m. on with Chris on the Iron Sharpens Iron radio program. And then on Saturday, it's Juan and me once again going mano a mano in a debate, but this time as our own selves on the ontological argument. I'm going to be arguing this is the best argument for God's existence. Tavo is absolutely incorrect to say that it's not a good argument. I saw your post. But yeah, I think it's the best argument for God's existence.
Listen to my show first, and then there'll be time enough for you to change your mind before you embarrass yourself on the show. It is absolutely the worst apologetic argument of all time. Even if you believe that it's true, that it describes a true thing that is in the universe, the argument itself is a bad way to come about it.
I disagree. Most academics disagree. It's lay people aren't persuaded. I don't know why, but academics, it's always ontological. So,
hey, the crowd can't be wrong. Follow it. What could possibly go wrong, Dale?
All right, so that'll be Saturday at 1 p.m. on Juan's Modern Atheism channel. But other than that, I'm going to go and get dinner. But yeah, thank you, everybody, and happy Easter, everyone. Take care.
All right. Thank you. So Tavo,